Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and fellow participants. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome you today at the joint Economic History Conference of the European Association for Banking and Financial History and the Hungarian Central Bank, the Magyar Nemzeti Bank. It is a great honor for us to be this year the co-host of the annual meeting and the conference of the EABH during the centennial year of our central bank. Let me express my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who has worked tirelessly over the last years to make this event possible. At the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, we firmly believe that it is through the lens of history that we can perceive trends or patterns from different eras, offering us valuable insights into addressing contemporary challenges. The fact that major economic events are infrequent elevates the role of economic history in understanding the aftermath of similar past occurrences, such as episodes of hyperinflation. As 2024 is the centenary year of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, and I would like to reminisce the words of Sándor Popovics, our first governor, who emphasized the significance of economic history knowledge concerning the practices of economics. He believed 100 years ago that our endeavor to fully understand the frameworks of economics would be incomplete if we didn't rely on the lessons that we can draw from recalling the past. At the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, we are fully committed to adhering to the advice of our first governor, who managed the central bank between 1924 and 1935 and had a prominent role in combating hyperinflation after the First World War and the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Based on historic experience, we are already aware of that high inflation and hyperinflation are complex phenomena typically triggered by factors such as wars, excessive debt, protectionism, and import substitution, the collapse of demand and/or supply, the flight of foreign capital, and disruptions in the dynamic of central bank money creation. Historically, these factors have led to periods of massive economic instability. Since the price revolution of the 16th century Europe, price level has always been a key factor concerning how people feel about the state of the economy. Although this sentiment concerning the value of money has not changed in the past decades, what changes over history is how central banks and governments react and intervene. There were times when price and wage controls were implemented by the fiscal side, or severe monetary tightening programs were introduced by monetary authorities. We all know that the economic and social consequences of these policies. Learning from the historical experiences of crises of the 20th century, the prevailing idea of the past decades has been delegating the goal of reaching price stability to the central banks and granting them independence in fulfilling their primary mandate. This commitment was later complemented by the inflation targeting regime in several advanced and emerging economies. All this led to the low inflation area of the past decade, which, however, has been disrupted by the events unfolding since early 2020. I'm sure that this new inflation period will also be a research topic for future economic historians. They might view that the tranquility of the 2010s as a unique period in global economic history, while the 2020s could be seen as a return to historical economic averages. Time will tell. What is sure for now is that after decades of price stability, the return of inflation in 2021 and its widespread impacts shocked economists, politicians, and societies as well. Discussion started on the roots and causes of the phenomenon, and there were politicians as well as economists who called the price control based on economic historical examples. That was the point where we relied not only on historical experiences, but also on the knowledge how to use it wisely to draw the right conclusion in the current settings and circumstances. Let me recall a quote from 2010 when Jean-Claude Trichet, then President of the European Central Bank, noted that in the face of the crisis, we felt abandoned by conventional tools. We were held by one of the areas of economic literature, historical analysis. Most importantly, the historical record told us what mistakes to avoid. As a former economist, Professor Ben Bernanke studied the Great Depression for many years and decades, and as chairman of the Federal Reserve, he had the ability and courage to act, as the title of his biography states, to avoid another Great Depression in 1928. Now it seems that central banks have learned their lessons from the 1970s, and this time they acted quickly and decisively while communicating clearly. In fact, emerging market central banks performed particularly well in terms of policy communication in comparison to their advanced economic counterparts, as stated by a study published by researchers of the London School of Economics last fall. In this era of heightening financial volatility and higher inflation, central banks are aware of that their primary task is to ensure price stability and financial stability. In course of the globally synchronized efforts of central banks, two factors proved to be predominant. First, central banks' credibility deriving from their independence, and second, the ability to anchor expectations, which can be attributed to the successful implementation of inflation targeting mechanisms. As of June 2024, we find ourselves in a more favorable situation in terms of the level of inflation. It is worth noting that in January 2023, inflation in Hungary peaked at over 25%. The central bank reacted decisively by starting the rate hike cycle early on. In fact, it was among the first in Europe to start raising rates. The effective rate even reached 18%. It was a very strong monetary reaction, and following this peak, a rapid disinflationary process took place. Within a year, inflation is brought back within the central bank's target range by the first 4 months of 2024. The strong monetary reaction also helped in maintaining financial stability. The significant progress is commendable, yet the financial stage of the disinflationary process remaining challenging, as evidenced in various parts of the world. According to our forecasts, inflation in Hungary could temporarily rise again in the next few months, which necessitates a careful and patient approach to monetary policy. The interest rate cut cycle initiated in Hungary a year ago aims to implement a monetary policy that supports both disinflation and financial market stability. Once the price stability is restored and the robust demand environment is secured, the conditions will be favorable for the corporate sector as well as for households to start a new takeoff. The Magyar Nemzeti Bank provided ample liquidity to several segments of the economy to support this process. Achieving a stable and low inflation is a serious trial for all central banks. There were serene voices arguing in favor of modifying the inflation's target, specifically increasing them. But central banks are aware that in a high inflation environment, such a change would have been a disaster, both for monetary policy credibility and for inflation expectations of the general public. By now, it is evident that in contrast to the United States of America, where inflation is rather dominated by demand-side forces, in the case of Europe, the current inflation path has become much more sensitive to supply shocks. While some have suggested greater flexibility on the side of the monetary policy, we believe that supply shocks should be addressed with supply-side measures. Nevertheless, ensuring the sustainability of price levels amidst short-term cyclical and long-run structural changes is crucial. To accommodate this process, the focus for Magyar Nemzeti Bank is on data-driven, yet patient and trend-aware decision-making. A lot of central banks have dual or multiple mandates, but today, balancing the support of economic growth and the reach of inflation target is increasingly difficult, especially as we face the dual need of restoring fiscal credibility through curbing deficits and at the same time an increased financing of green transition. Not to mention that the cost of the central bank's efforts of promoting growth resulted in central bank losses, the reduction of which also must be addressed in the coming years. Although there is no sign of a financial crisis to unfold or evidence of price-wage spiral, which means that monetary policy is doing its job, there are several factors like the ongoing geopolitical conflicts, changes in productivity levels, or the high level of public debt, which continue to pose significant challenges. To ease the potential effect of contemporary megatrends like digitalization or green transition or the demographic developments, the present inflation dynamics shall be back to their target range as soon as possible. Central banks can be a great part of the solution, but it's essential to note that no solution can be achieved at the expense of compromising monetary independence. Based on historical evidence, we must emphasize the critical importance of central bank independence. It is a cornerstone of economic stability and market confidence, ensuring that monetary policy can be conducted effectively and without undue influences. In the current context, this means that fiscal and monetary policy should be mutually supportive towards each other to ensure the effectiveness of policy measures. To conclude, let me say I firmly believe that to succeed in this volatile decade, monetary policy needs to respond to ongoing and upcoming challenges appropriately. This highlights the importance of informing decision-making by historical experience as much as by economic theory. Today we have an impressive list of distinguished speakers and panelists, so the opportunity is offered to exchange views and insights on the topic of inflation and hyperinflation. I wish to encourage a robust discussion for the speakers and participants. Thank you for your kind attention, and I hope that you will have enough time to look around a little bit our beautiful Budapest city. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Governor Kandrash, for this introduction and putting our conference into the perspective of the Hungarian inflation and the bigger context of what we need to look forward to have stable monetary policies. I'm quickly going to run you now through how we do this conference. So you have all the programs with the details, but by and large we have 3 blocks. In the morning we have 4 speakers. It will start with Pierre Siklos, who is one of the eminent specialists on Hungarian inflation. Then we will continue with Harold James from Princeton University, who does a broader perspective of who made inflation. Then we're going to talk about hyperinflation in emerging markets. That is presented by Moritz Kramer, who has many years at Standard & Poor's, and then Federico Sturzenegger from the former governor of the Central Bank of Argentina and today advisor to President Milei, is talking about inflation, hyperinflation in the Argentinian context. Then we have our lunch break, and we will then do 3 workshops that will be interrupted by a panel where we have representatives of central banks or former representatives of central banks talking about how central banks deal with hyperinflation today, when there for decades there was no sign of hyperinflation at all. So how do they keep the memory alive, and how important it is for them? Before we go into the subject, I want to talk about a side issue which I, as a Swiss person, can. And when we talk about hyperinflation, we always talk about the damage that hyperinflation does. And if you could put up my slides, that would be great. I want to talk about the flip side of hyperinflation, what it does to countries who do not suffer hyperinflation. It has huge economic consequences. And Switzerland, as a financial center in the heart of Europe, is one of the beneficiaries of hyperinflation after the First and the Second World War. We never talk about this, and everybody thinks that the Swiss financial center is a function of banking secrecy. It's the other way around. The banking secrecy is a function of Switzerland becoming a financial center. So the coins that you see here, these are coins from the Latin Monetary Union. We had a conference about this about 4 years ago, and talked about this, about monetary unions, and that was in Sofia. It's very interesting. I encountered that phenomenon as a young boy when my grandfather gave me, to my 10th birthday, 10 Swiss franc frenary. The problem was, on this 10 Swiss franc frenary, there was King Leopold from Belgium, and it was a Belgian franc, and I couldn't understand how a Belgian coin could be a Swiss franc frenary. So, but it was very simple. Same weight, same gold content. It was exchangeable, and it's one of these coins that had survived the melting down of gold during the First World War, when all these countries had to pay. So Switzerland kept what other countries had to give up through hyperinflation. And in Switzerland, these coins still circulate. Like other things, they're relatively rare, and that's probably why my grandfather gave me this. I had no idea, but later I understood, oh, that's what it was. So when we talk about hyperinflation, it's usually quite simple. It boils down to the loss of control of monetary and fiscal policies by central banks and governments, and it ends up in very unpleasant things like this photo from the Weimar Republic. I don't know whether it was posted or whether that was a real photo, but a woman using bank bills as heating material because there was no other available. That tells you how much money there was. At the very same time this photo was taken, Zurich looked like this. So you have on the right-hand side Credit Suisse, straight ahead is, at that time, was Swiss Bank Corporation. Now it's UBS main quarter and looks a bit different. It's more modern. Switzerland had a booming time. Yes, Switzerland had inflation after the First World War, but it was very benign compared to others. And I had, if you read my bio, I was for 5 years a private banker at Lombard Odier. We have photos of bags of silver coins in our vaults. Lombard Odier got inundated with silver coins from French and Belgian people who had their accounts with us and brought their silver money because they knew in a week's time it would be converted into paper money, which then can be manipulated. At that time, Lombard Odier didn't know what to do, so where do you invest if you suddenly have an inflow of money? So the infrastructure wasn't there, but these photos exist. It's not something that we publish because it creates the wrong image for a private bank having bags of silver coins in your vault, but that's actually how it was, and that's how the Geneva private banker and in general the Swiss private banking system became wealthy. Another thing is the Zurich Stock Exchange. How is it possible that a country that has 0.1% of total world population had in the 1960s the third largest stock exchange in the world? How is that possible? That's only possible because all the people who wanted to protect the purchasing power of their money brought the money to Switzerland, and after the Second World War there were only two convertible currencies, that was the dollar and the Swiss franc. So therefore it happened, and that's the reason why in 1932 Switzerland needed a new, bigger stock exchange, and the same happened actually in Geneva. The Swiss Stock Exchange only merged in the 70s. Before that, there were one in Geneva and one in Thing. And I remember that very early in my career when I was a corporate finance banker in Credit Suisse. One of the first things I did, I brought the chemical group AGA from Sweden for a secondary listing to the Zurich Stock Exchange. That's what we did as bankers, because we had access to capital, and every company wants to have lowest possible cost of capital, so therefore they did a secondary listing in Switzerland. That was our business model, and that business model stays today. Another thing that nobody talks about is the Swiss insurance companies. How is it possible that Switzerland has such large insurance companies? Some have now merged. Winterthur is now part of AXA, but Zurich Insurance, Swiss Life, and Swiss Re have survived. They are one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, and again, so it was a function of money coming in and then invested in life insurance policies. So I talked already about this. These are how the coins looked like in the Latin Monetary Union. They were fully convertible. This currency union actually survived formally the First World War. It was dissolved in 1926, but in 1926 it was so unreal. It was only Switzerland who was sticking to it. Switzerland actually abolished the gold standard only in 1934 after America went off the gold standard, but until then it stuck informally to this currency union, including the currencies. And again, so one memory of my childhood is the discussion I had with my mother when in 1966 the Swiss government decided that the silver coins we had until that time would be replaced by pure nickel coins, because people started to buy Swiss francs to melt them down and to extract the silver, because the silver content of the Swiss franc pieces was higher than the nominal value of the Swiss franc, and therefore they replaced them with nickel coins. But until I grew up with coins that had real silver in it, and I still have some of them, it's a beautiful memory to have, and it tells you that these things are not that far in the past. Now, this is a photo of how First World War looked in Switzerland. That's, you will immediately notice the difference how it looked in other countries. So that's a platoon leader with some of his platoon. This trench would not have survived 30 seconds of German artillery fire, but Switzerland was neutral, and it benefited the economy extremely well. It meant that we didn't have that much expenses as other countries that surrounded us, and was a time when Switzerland was completely surrounded by countries who were part of the First World War. So Italy was on the Allied side, France was of course, then you had Germany and Austria, so which Hungary was part of at that time. On the other side, we were completely surrounded and therefore became refugees, and became beneficiaries. And that was a time when passports didn't really exist. That's also something that we forget. Passports are an invention of the First World War, and therefore money could circulate relatively freely. So people who could travel brought the silver coins and the gold coins to Switzerland and left it there. Some of them died. That's then the reason why Switzerland has black money that was never claimed. You may remember 10 years ago that blew up as a big political scandal, but the roots are there. All the other countries converted their their precious metal coins into paper money. That is, I couldn't find the French poster, so I took the English one. The English were the ones who managed it well and repaid their debt. Everybody else did it through devaluation. The French francs, which was equal to the Swiss francs at the beginning of the First World War, dropped to 20% of its thing. Just think about what that means for ordinary citizens. They lose 80% of their life savings. At the end of the day, money has two purposes. It is a transfer mechanism to settle trades, and the second one is a storage for value, for not consumed value that you want to consume in the future, and you lose 80% of this. Italy doesn't look that here, it's against the British pound, so I just couldn't find the convenient charts. Italy is the same. I remember before the euro arrived that whenever you went to Italy, so you suddenly became a millionaire, because 1 Swiss franc was 6 million lire, and you paid these very big bills. And despite currency reforms, which usually consisted on cancelling 2 zeros at the end, so it continued and continued. And Italy knows financial stability or monetary stability only since the introduction of the euro. So I'm a little bit short because I don't have time to go into details, but by and large, that's a story. And that's a story I told you of the Swiss franc coins. When you have a Swiss franc coins, the one with the Helvetia in the center and on top, they still exist. They look the same. All other currencies have gone. So that's hugely beneficial for an economy which has monetary stability over decades. That's one of the reasons why Switzerland is so rich. That there are other reasons. We had the pharmaceutical industry, we had the mechanical industry, which could re-equip Europe after the Second World War. We have tourism as a driver, but the financial sector is one key driver. And usually in a country, financial sector makes about 6 to 7% of GDP. In Switzerland, it still makes 14%. That tells you how important. That means Switzerland has, through that phenomenon, a wealthy middle class, which makes Switzerland politically very stable. That's one of the consequences, and that's not our doing. That's other countries descending in hyperinflation due to war. The stock exchange of Switzerland has now normalized. It's not the third largest as in the 60s, but it's still number 13. Just think about it. We are larger than the Swiss stock exchange, than the German stock exchange. That's quite of unheard when you think. So Switzerland is 10% of the German GDP. So that these are things which are still visible in today's history. And being, as I said, a country with 0.1% of world population, having the 13th largest stock exchange is quite a remarkable achievement, and I think is something that will stay. Now, coming back to our conference today, hyperinflation is a subject that exists still today, whilst we got used to it. In the G20 group, only Turkey has a very high level of inflation. The rest doesn't see, so therefore we don't talk a lot about it. But kind of we know that Venezuela has hyperinflation. Kind of we know that Lebanon, so it's related to civil wars or the disintegration of states. But in the case of Turkey, it's not. And in the case of Turkey, it's overinvestment, solving problems with printing press, and a political system that thinks that high interest rates drive high inflation, and that leads to very different results. That I'm not going to talk about it because I covered that already in the beginning. I would like now to open the formal sessions of this conference. We're having block number 1 before the coffee break. Remember, coffee break means photographer first, before you have your espresso. And we're having Pierre, who's going to talk. He's one of the probably the people who knows Hungarian hyperinflation the best, and he made all his way over from Canada to join us today. And he will be immediately followed by Harold James, who gives a little bit a broader picture. So question and answers will be then done for the block combined by Pierre and Harold. So please write down the questions that we have for Pierre, that we don't forget them. Now, Pierre, may I invite you?
Well, I want to thank the organizers, the EABH and the National Bank of Hungary, for asking me to come and talk about a topic that's, well, brings me back to the beginning of my career. And I guess, which I thought actually most people had ceased to be interested in, but there seems to be a bit of a revival. So let me first start with sort of popular expressions of what people think about when they think about hyperinflation. And you can see the cartoon on the left treats money as rubbish, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The second one essentially shows you the same thing, except it's something much more recent. It's hyperinflation in Venezuela with, again, boatloads of money, but given what you see on the right, rather worthless. And the last one is something that economists became interested in later, which is, but they're still interested in, which is the independence of central banks, but probably more accurately should be referred to as the autonomy of central banks, because the independence or autonomy, however you wish to term it, is something that's fragile. And certainly in the case of hyperinflations, not much needs to be said, but it tends to be lost. But it also highlights the need for monetary and fiscal policy to operate in tandem. Not necessarily all the time. There are times, as we've experienced in the last few decades, where fiscal policy is passive and monetary policy is active, and vice versa, but sooner or later, the two have to act together, otherwise you have bad outcomes. With one of the worst outcomes would be in the case of hyperinflation. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to focus for the most part on what we've learned, or what can we learn from the second Hungarian hyperinflation, and because that's really how I started research in this area. I want to spend a few moments talking about why not just economic historians, but economists more generally are interested in or fascinated with hyperinflation. And although I may know a lot about the second Hungarian hyperinflation, in the profession overall, it probably doesn't rank first, even if it ranks first when it comes to the level of inflation achieved in 1946 in Hungary, and then draw some broader conclusions about hyperinflations along a variety of dimensions. So I come to this topic a long time ago, and it was quite by accident. When I did my PhD, I had nothing to do with hyperinflation, and it was my then supervisor who gave me basically a journalistic article about hyperinflation in Hungary, and because he knew my name was of Hungarian origin, he said, well, maybe you should read this and think about this, and I did. It was very interesting, but did nothing until after I graduated and began my career, and quite by accident, by asking family relatives in Hungary, did I come to this topic, and it helped very much. It was actually critical that I had the good fortune that my parents taught me Hungarian, and I knew and was able to speak and read in Hungarian, because that became obviously essential when I eventually came to the archives, the National Archives and the archives of the National Bank of Hungary, and began to discover what had not been discovered about the Hungarian hyperinflation. I'll come back to that in a little moment. And really, after initially spending my career writing about, not just about the Hungarian hyperinflation, but hyperinflations more generally, it just again happens that in the last couple of years, a PhD student of mine and I have come back to this topic, and I'll briefly mention this at the end, where we're looking at the hyperinflation, or the recent hyperinflation in Venezuela, from a slightly different perspective than the one that you typically look at when you study hyperinflation. Now, I showed you, in the previous slide, you can see the reference to, and it took quite a lot of effort back then in the 1980s for me to obtain this famous, at least in Hungary, picture of them sweeping the penger at the end of the hyperinflation, illustrating what you saw in the previous cartoon about how worthless money became. but you know, the world is a funny place, and this is from my own personal collection. And what you'll notice is a couple of things. First is that if you keep some of these things, they may have been worthless at the time, but if you go on eBay, they're not quite as worthless anymore. And these aren't even the most valuable ones. They're more valuable ones still. But you'll notice three things. The first thing you'll notice is at the top left-hand side is when the government was finding it nearly impossible to raise revenues through conventional taxation means, they first started to put a stamp on the notes, basically devaluing the notes substantially. When that became insufficient, or you'll see on the right-hand side, they began to index the notes. And so on a daily basis, and I'll come back to this because this is an important feature that is often not known about the Hungarian hyperinflation, they began to issue an index, a price index on a daily basis, so that instead of raising the face value of the notes, you basically have some starting value, and then every day it would be worth more in nominal terms. And the bottom left-hand side illustrates how, you know, when you start to add a lot of zero, it looks a little bit, it doesn't look very good. So instead of adding more zeros, they basically said, well, now it's 100,000 or 100,000 billions and 100,000 and so on. And so you effectively add zeros in that fashion, illustrating again the impact of hyperinflation on the note issue. It shows both the speed of change in prices, but also how clever policymakers can be, even though they implement bad policies, to sustain the note issue. So why are we, at least economic historians and economists more generally, fascinated with hyperinflation? And there are a number of reasons. I'll come back to some of the ones I think are the most interesting, but it waxes and wanes, and that's true of many topics. We become interested in a topic, and then it sort of disappears, and then it comes back. But one way to see this is if you plot on the left-hand side global inflation, and on the right-hand side you look at one source, and it's not the only source, Google Ngram, to see how often the topic of hyperinflation attracts interest. And it's not because of my book. There are several books published around that time, not just about the Hungarian hyperinflation, but lots of other hyperinflations. But you can see it starts to rise as inflation rises. So they're almost like mirror images. However, this hides an important feature, one of which I want to make a point about. And that is that when you break down the Google Ngram and you start asking about the, I don't know how well you can see this, but the German hyperinflation, the French, the assignat, which Eugene White will talk about, the Hungarian hyperinflation actually is way at the bottom. It's almost hard to see. And it's hard in Google Ngram to make the distinction between the first and the second hyperinflation, another issue I'll come back to. But hyperinflations more generally can be popular, but when you break it down, some hyperinflations attract much more interest than others. All right, so why are we fascinated? Well, there's a number of reasons, some of which were alluded to in the opening remarks, which is it's a symptom of what now is often referred to as a polycrisis, where you have crises of a variety of types which converge, and the policymakers, whether it's wittingly or unwittingly, are unable to cope and allow inflation to rise to remarkable levels. And you'll see a little bit later on some extraordinary numbers in the Hungarian case. But economists quickly learn that while laboratory-type experiments are pure ones are rare in economics, the hyperinflation one comes closest. And I know Tom Sargent, who was supposed to be here, is one that has made the point, and I'll make some remarks about that a little bit later. But it goes back to earlier than Tom Sargent. Lionel Robbins referred to this as these are pathological examples. Tom Sargent brought something new to the analysis, which is the topic of how hyperinflations end. And more recently, a more recent Nobel laureate, Finn Kindlin, referred to hyperinflations as an example of extending his time inconsistency idea, which for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize, to time inconsistency disease, where you repeatedly make these bad policy choices and you end up, in effect, stuck in a bad equilibrium. Now, for economists more generally, as opposed to economic historians, hyperinflations were wonderful exercises because it allowed us to use new econometric techniques that were developed in the last few decades to ask all sorts of questions, and I'll give you one of these examples. And I think perhaps one reason why hyperinflations have experienced a little bit of a renewal is because of behavioral economics. We start to try to understand how people behave in these extraordinary circumstances, and they appear or not appear to behave rationally under these circumstances. And of course, there are these other factors that I've alluded to earlier and that were alluded to in the opening remarks, which is all wars, the breakdown of relationship between governments and their central banks, and as a device to quickly eliminate financial wealth, but also the ability in a hyperinflation, partly because of the duration of these episodes, to abstract from certain things that can be problematic when you're an economist and you're trying to model a phenomenon. So you tend to abstract from the real factor, but as I'll point out very shortly, that may or may not hold in some of the instances of high inflation or hyperinflation. All right, so just to start with a few figures for Hungary and for other hyperinflations, just to again underscore that although the Hungarian hyperinflation may be known to economic historians, if you look at an alternative to Ngrams, so you look at Google Scholar, you see that some of the other hyperinflations, and notably the German hyperinflation, are studied much more frequently. Hyperinflation in Argentina, which Federico will talk about, and Zimbabwe, which was also alluded to in one of the slides, can be studied at least as often, if not more often. All right, so going forward, let me then begin with the sort of the standard traditional story of hyperinflation, which comes from Kagan. And those of us who study hyperinflation frequently are aware of the first part of the definition, which is hyperinflation as he defined it as price increases that exceed 50% per month. But the second part of the exercise or the definition is frequently forgotten, which is the part that indicates that it ends when prices increases drop below at least that amount and has to stay below that amount for at least a year. That tends to be forgotten, and as a result, it plays a role in some of the analyses, subsequent analyses of hyperinflation and their origins and their consequences. But for the most part, I'll try to retain both parts of the definition going forward. Now, of course, we know there's a tension between hyperinflation and high or very high inflation. And this is a table from Stan Fisher and Ratna Sahay and Carlos Vague when they wrote this survey of episodes of high inflation. And what they did, which was a very good thing, which is that they combined episodes of high inflation or very high inflation and hyperinflation. Even if you can't see the details, you can tell from the number of digits what the hyperinflation examples are. And you have things like Brazil and Congo, etc., and the very high inflation rates. And it is there as a reminder that the threshold between high, very high, and hyperinflation is really an artificial one. But it is an important one which should not be forgotten because it plays a role in then the extent to which we can get away with other assumptions, such as abstracting from the real effects of a hyperinflation. We tend to push that aside because that's what allowed Kagan to propose his sort of model of adaptive expectations and how inflations and hyperinflations accelerate over time. But it may not actually, is an assumption that may not actually hold in some of the cases. Well, the other point that's sometimes made about hyperinflations is that they tend to be brief in duration relative to other episodes. Again, that's a little bit misleading, as we'll see. Now, coming back to the Hungarian hyperinflation, why is it less well known? Well, in a podcast for the BBC that I participated a little over a year ago with two other, one was an economic historian, a Hungarian economic historian, the other was a social historian. We mused about this. The BBC interviewer had never heard of this episode and was wondering why it was less well known. Was it because it was brief? Well, chances are that there are other factors as well. One has to do with the fact that Hungary was on the losing side, if you like, of the war, and so if you believe that history is written by the victors, then that's one reason to forget about it. The other possibility, as I discovered much later, or early in my career, but much later in life, is language. Of course, when much of the episode or much of the data and the documentation is in Hungarian, it's not going to be as widely accessible as other languages, for example, whether it's Spanish or some other, or German, the German language. That obviously also doesn't help. There's also a little bit of an element of, for reasons that we won't get into, the subsequent regime that took over in Hungary clearly wanted to repress that part of history. It's not a very pleasant part of history, and you tend to want to repress those types of ideas. Now, one of the other things that you notice when you study hyperinflations is you tend to think, well, these are rare events, and they're not that rare. They happen usually once in a country, not more often. But when you look at a list of hyperinflations in history, and this is just a snippet, it's not even a complete list, you notice two things, that, and it's not necessarily evident entirely from this slide, but you have to combine this with the earlier slide, that the duration of these episodes is not necessarily shorter than episodes of high or very high inflation. And secondly, it's not really a black swan. There are many cases. Hungary, of course, is notable because it had two hyperinflations, but there are plenty of other examples of countries that have experienced more than hyperinflation more than once. So it's not really a black swan, and that's another topic that tends to be forgotten. All right. And here's some other examples that are more recent. With the timing, I'll skip this because I think I've already made the point. Okay, and I've already mentioned something about some of the reasons why the second Hungarian case may be less well known, but I think I've made all the points I want to make here. So at the time when Kagan wrote his well-known piece, he had a few bottom lines, but his bottom lines, of course, focused on the development and the acceleration of inflation, and he focused on the possibility of how reforms or attempted reforms might affect the demand for money. He also he tried to address, because of his model, the instability of hyperinflation, whether it's a bubble that, if you like, that bursts. Of course, the one I referred to earlier, which in the modern parlance is referred to as seigniorage, or the role of the Laffer curve, which is how governments can benefit from inflation and high inflation, and that's a link between fiscal and monetary policy. But Kagan, of course, was rather silent about the ending of hyperinflation, and his point was a very restricted one, a very focused one, and he tended to underplay or underemphasize the historical context and the political context in which hyperinflations emerge, and that turns out to be not only interesting, but very important to understand both how they accelerate, how inflation can accelerate, and also how inflation can end. Now, I came to this, as I said earlier, because I happened to learn Hungarian, and quite by accident, when I started on this topic, I came across a book that was almost impossible to find, but one of my relatives was able to find. And being a sort of an applied econometrician, of course, I yearned for some data because Kagan's analysis was on a monthly basis. The Hungarian hyperinflation, the second one especially, was rather short in duration. And I didn't think there was very much more I could say about this given the data. But I came across this book, as I said, that was very difficult to obtain. And one of the things that was remarkable, this would not be acceptable today, but there were no sources provided. There was simply basically a picture provided. But what was notable is that this author was able to construct daily, which is quite remarkable, daily prices, daily money supply figures. And you can see from the bottom right-hand side the amount of circulation. These were fabulous, extraordinary numbers. But the fact that there were daily observations and the narratives around the development and the acceleration of hyperinflation at the time, those were things that were completely missing in the Kagan story. This is not a criticism of Kagan. He was trying to look at hyperinflations more generally, but it's something that I thought was quite remarkable. And so I went on this quest to find this data. It was not straightforward. It took quite some time. I was able to certainly find very good price data. The money supply data is a little bit more questionable. But one of the things that allowed me to do that and the development of econometric methods over time was to ask new questions or to revisit old questions. So in the top left-hand side, you have two very different pictures of what happens to prices. The line you have difficulty seeing at the horizontal axis is what we knew at the time. And when I went finally into the archives and I was able to build a new data set, the upward sloping line is the, let's call it the corrected version of what happened to prices at the time. The bottom left-hand side illustrates a point, again, that's often forgotten about the second hyperinflation that Kagan looked at, which is that he ended the story very much, several months before the end of the hyperinflation. I was able to extend that considerably, and of course the picture looks different. And just to give you an illustration of what you can do now, but you could not do, certainly not in Kagan's time and not even at the beginning of my career, is you can ask questions about whether the developments in prices were unstable in some sense. So you can now, you have these new tests that are available. And what's interesting about these tests is that they show that when the bubble did burst, when there was some signs of instability, it happens in May, which is well after the sample that Kagan used. In other words, he could not, even if he had the technique with the data he had, he could not have found out, gotten an answer of that kind. So that brings me now to the end of hyperinflation. And this is where, of course, Tom Sargent's role, it becomes an important one. And he talks about, reminds us again about the laboratory type experiment, which was not a new idea, but he focuses on how extreme these episodes are. But the second hyperinflation doesn't make his list. He talks about other hyperinflations. And he's not the only one who talks about the end of hyperinflation. Alan Meltzer talks about this issue, and he highlights, and this is part of that I've underlined, which is the role of politics. And Tom Sargent was purely interested in economic aspects, but politics plays an important role. And he talks about, and Alex Kuckerman, who passed away recently, he talks about the role of the commitment to a policy regime and the political cost of breaking it. And I won't have time to go into the detail, but the regime that was incoming in Hungary implicitly understood these features. And as a result, were able to institute a reform, not just of the conventional variety, but it was conventional plus a number of other additional features. Now, the other thing that I think the reason the Hungarian hyperinflation of 45, 46 deserves more interest is because it demonstrates in a way that perhaps other hyperinflations may not to the same degree, how resilient society can be under these extreme circumstances. Would back the currency even though gold would play a little or no role. Then there was a problem of how Hungary could be connected to the rest of the financial system more globally. So soon after, the regime was able to get agreement from the British to access the payments mechanism. And as a result, the combination of all these factors meant that in addition to the promises they made to keep some form of price stability, they were able to demonstrate some credibility. Now, I only have a few minutes, so I won't go through all the details. One other thing I want to point out is it was not in the previous slide, but they also understood the role of supply factors. So they made sure to to stockpile large amounts of goods, primarily foodstuffs, to bring it in at the beginning of the reform to ensure that the public would see that there were ample goods available in the market, because they were convinced that this too, the supply side factor, would help keep prices down. Now, there are also some limitations, however, on the Hungarian example, and this is important to keep in mind, which is that the regime would change quite substantially soon after, if not already, when the hyperinflation ended. Prices in particular would cease to have the same function or the same role as before. And so, you know, when you compare data after the hyperinflation ends relative to when it was ongoing, is tricky, because you're not talking about prices that were necessarily freely determined. There are also going to be limitations because about the dates when certain things happened, certain plans for reform, certain changes were made. There are differences in views when I went through the archives, differences in the actual numbers, which is not surprising, because when you're thinking about how quickly prices change during hyperinflation, it's quite clear that there's a chance of mismeasurement. And related to that, about the value, the prices that were being published, because most of the information we have were about prices in Budapest. We know much less about what happened outside. We know much less about, for example, alternatives such as gold, silver, even US dollars that would be used as substitutes for the domestic currency. But one intriguing example, which brings me to the behavioral aspect, is the role of memory. And the reason I mention this is because, in particular, when it comes to the German hyperinflation, we often hear how the German hyperinflation is an example of where the reason Germans like low and stable inflation is because they remembered the first, their hyperinflation in the 1920s. And this goes back to von Mises, who basically made the same remark. Although I have some sympathy with this view, I'm rather skeptical of it. I think what I think about when I think about memory is the tricks that memory can play. And in particular, I note the so-called Mandela effect, where you think something happened, but it never really did, but it's ingrained in your mind, and you're convinced it happened. So it's maybe a form of the Mandela effect that drives the views in Germany. Now, Switzerland might be a counterexample of that, but of course, Switzerland never had a hyperinflation. So let me add, because I'm out of time, that there's still new things to study about hyperinflation. I had someone contact me recently who had compiled a list of the nominal values of stamps that were issued during the time. And you can see the fabulous, the incredible numbers. And the link between those prices and other prices is a subject that's certainly can be studied. And again, the data are available daily. Then more recently, and I'll conclude with that very quickly because I'm over time, is with my student and a colleague of mine, we're looking back now at the Venezuelan hyperinflation and an aspect that has not been relevant in other hyperinflation, which is the role of sanctions and the extent to which sanctions may have either precipitated the hyperinflation or accelerated the hyperinflation. And that's work that's still ongoing. Here's a picture of some things that happened or have happened in Venezuela. And when we're done, I hope to be able to give you some firm answers. And I guess because I'm over time, I'll conclude. And I want to make a point about hyperinflation and the role of the real side of the economy, that somehow we can ignore the real side of the economy. But when we look at some of these data, these are highly aggregated data, there is, depending on how you slice and dice the data, there seems to be some link between developments in high inflation episodes and the real side of the economy. And I'll just stop there.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm very, very honored to be here with the Magyar Nemzeti Bank and with the EABH. It's a great pleasure to be here, the 100th birthday of the Magyar Nemzeti Bank, and to think about this great topic. Can we get the slides up for this? Otherwise, I can talk without the slides, but yeah, wonderful. The story of great inflations is often one of helplessness, when a political and social system is paralyzed into such dysfunctionality that it's impossible to self-correct itself. In that sense, I think hyperinflation often becomes a demonstration of circumstances in which sovereignty collapses and external assistance is desperately needed. The external action may and usually does bring new resources that are needed to combat the dysfunctionality, but it's also required to effect change in the political and economic ordering of a society, an imposition which often provokes a strong backlash. So I'm going to go back again, and I think you'll hear some of this throughout the day, to something that was already mentioned by Pierre Siklos, that there's something about the early 1920s that serves as an iconic moment. And can I move this on? Yeah. So Tom Sargent's laboratory experiments has already been cited as a way of understanding this moment. Laboratory experiments in which the elemental forces that cause and can be used to stop inflation are easiest to spot, and we're thinking of Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Poland. So 4 countries that had been part of the Central Powers during the First World War. And the question of who resolves this, I think, is a fascinating one, in that there are 2 versions of how to resolve an inflation. One is that you get somebody from the outside to think about what needs to be done and to reorder it. And this is an old concept. In some ways, the creditor arrangements in the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire are a model for this. Jamie Martin recently produced a book called The Meddlers, which has this concept in its title. And the idea is that the meddlers were the international organizations, and above all the League of Nations in the 1920s, that then served as the model for the International Monetary Fund after the Second World War. And indeed, there is a substantial continuity in personnel even. So somebody like Jacques Polak, who's really crucial in developing the thought model of the IMF, is also somebody who had experience with the League in the 1930s. So that's one model. The other model is that this is something, the inflation, that arose out of a problem in the society itself. And so the society needs to be strong enough to solve the problem on its own. In the modern parlance, it's to take ownership. So you need to have some kind of heroic figure who really stabilizes the economic situation. And I think Federico is going to talk later about exactly this kind of circumstances, how you need a heroic figure to come in and stabilize them. And so this is the alternative model. What you've got there is a electoral poster on the screen from the German Democratic Party, which was one of the centrist liberal parties in the Weimar Republic that did quite well in the elections of the middle of the 1920s and did miserably by the end of the 1920s and into the Great Depression. And there's a little poem underneath that. I don't know whether you can read that, but I'm going to translate it. The housewife can laugh again, who brought an end to all the strain of searches for food in vain. The Rentenbank, the Rentenmark of our man Schacht. And so Hjalmar Schacht, the man who was appointed as the central bank president in the very last weeks of the German inflation, became the hero that the Deutsche Demokratische Partei put on its electoral placard. And later, of course, in the 1930s, Hitler made a great deal of the fact that he had got Schacht on his side, and Schacht came back. He'd resigned from the government. He tried to bring the government down, the democratic government down in 1929. He resigned from the central bank, but he comes back again with Hitler, and Hitler regards Schacht as the guarantee of currency stability. So, heroic people. And I want to talk about briefly at least, about the fourth of the episodes of hyperinflation in the Sargent typology after the First World War, the Polish case, because it's, I think, less studied, much less studied than the German case, which, you know, in Pierre's slide, just had an enormous number of references. And Austria and Hungary after the First World War are better known. Poland is not, in part because there's a beautiful book about the Polish inflation, contemporary book, that was more or less the equivalent of the brilliant book that the Italian economist Costantino Bresciano Turoni wrote about the German hyperinflation. But the book on the Polish inflation was written by a man called Edward Taylor, or at least I pronounce him as Edward Taylor, but he should be properly pronounced Edvard Taylor, who, although he has this beautiful name, it's a Scottish name originally, but his family came in the 17th century from Scotland to Poland, and he's a Polish economist from Krakow who wrote this really, really stunning book. The hero of the Polish inflation, the man who stabilized on our own, is Władysław Grabski. He was finance minister and prime minister. And his main slogan is, on one's own. We do it by ourselves. I formed in my mind my own plan to balance the budget and carry out the currency reform on our own strength, forgetting the foreign loan and forswearing British financial experts. Because, you know, then, as in the 1990s, there were these foreign financial experts who came and gave advice, and so there was a British figure, Hilton Young, an American, Edwin Kemmerer. In the 1990s, I think many countries had Jeffrey Sachs giving them advice. So Grabski said, we ignore that. Well, why do we ignore that? Well, fundamentally, the inflation is a fiscal story, and I think there's really no doubt about that in the case of the post-First World War experiments. So kind of authoritative study by the League in retrospect, authored by Ragnar Nerkser. The Polish experience is of general interest in that it shows a remarkably close correlation between the budgetary position on the one hand and the exchange value of the currency on the other. Or Oskar Lange, the brilliant Polish economist, who was a very, very young man in his early 20s, wrote on the hyperinflation, and again makes the point that this is a fiscal matter, that politicians were dazzled. They thought they were creating, by means of inflation, wealth out of nothing. Or Stanisław Kaczyński, who was the first president of the new central bank, which is also the anniversary this year. Bank Polski was created, the predecessor of the current central bank, Narodowy Bank Polski, was created in 1924, Stanisław Kaczyński. The biggest plague of the Polish mark, the old currency, is the Polish treasury. Each money had an account at the bank that was effectively the central bank before Bank Polski, on which it drew liberally. Society became demoralized. It's the depositors who lose most, depositing the value of a pair of shoes and withdrawing the value of a roll of toilet paper. Or a tailor. Economic management becomes an instrument of the political fight. There's political inflationism. So basically, there's no doubt about this. And as Nerxa said, there's a very, very close correlation between the budget deficit, the notes in circulation, the wholesale price index. Indeed, it's closer in the Polish case than it is in the Austrian, Hungarian, or German case. But the question about this is then, how do you deal with this? If the budget deficit is driving everything, you need to get the fiscal stabilization in order to make the new monetary regime credible. And you can do that, but it's a very, very costly exercise. So the two finance ministers who tried to impose an effective fiscal package in post-World War I inflationary regimes were the German Matthias Erzberger and the Czech politician Alois Rasin, and both of them were assassinated. So you paid with your life for trying to make an effective fiscal reform. You got an enormous number of enemies, and they denounced them. Rasin, in particular, was a really brilliant figure, and spelt out exactly why we're doing the reform, why we need to do the reform, and what it would do. But it's actually then often translated into a continuation of wartime finance, in that what you're thinking of is a situation, I mean, in essence, all these regimes began with the First World War, and the First World War began with a concept that it would be financed. You would pay an enormous amount in the course of fighting a military conflict, but you don't need to worry about the enormous amount that you're having to pay, because your population won't be taxed. It will be the other side who will have to pay for it. And in particular, if you think of Erzberger and Rasin as being good finance ministers, the bad finance minister was also the greatest German economist of the pre-First World War era, Karl Helfferich, who, as Secretary of the Treasury in the First World War, made a speech in the Reichstag where he said, the cost of this war will hang like a weight around the necks of the defeated powers. So he was going to get Russia and get France to pay for the war. So you make somebody else pay for the war. And you have a zero-sum mentality. And in fact, in this kind of situation, you think that you can do the reform by taking away the wealth of people in the society who you think are enemies of the national state. And so, in some ways, the secret of Rasin's reform is not such a secret, in that it depends very much on the expropriation of the large landowners in Czechoslovakia who were mostly German speakers. And so the German speakers are regarded as the enemy. You can have an effective confiscation of property, a very high either confiscation or a levy on property. The Polish stabilization also, Grabski's main stabilization plank was a wealth tax, a wealth levy, and the wealth levy was going to fall heaviest on the richest areas, the industrial areas in Silesia, and often then on German enterprises. So there was a national element in how to make this work. Let me think about the fundamental drivers of inflation and then the specific ways in which it's dealt with. So really three drivers of the hyperinflation. Firstly, a low savings rate. Secondly, the failure of the government to do the fiscal balancing, and then the conscription of the central bank as monetizing the fiscal debt. And the central banks were quite explicit about that, that they had a patriotic duty to do this, and again, the kind of zero-sum imagery is taken into this, that the central banks say that they're doing their best for the government. And in fact, the unfortunate governor of the German central bank, of the Reichsbank during the German inflation, used to quite often do speeches in which he would celebrate the fact that the Reichsbank, the German central bank, the imperial bank, had acquired yet another new paper factory and yet another new printing work so that they could satisfy the enormous demand for banknotes. Because one of the phenomena of inflations, and particularly of hyperinflations, is that the real amount of money falls. And so the perception of this is that there's a shortage of notes and you need more notes in order to deal with the situation. So that is the story of the government failure, the fiscal failure, and the monetary policy failure. And we think of this, if we talk about it in modern terminology, as fiscal dominance. So the central bank can't really assert its influence, because if it did so, it would bring the government to a halt, and that would be a catastrophe. So the government has got the central bank in a kind of locked-in position where the central bank really simply has to respond to the government's necessity. And particularly if you're thinking about it in terms of a security situation, and that's very, very visible for the Polish case, because they've got the Soviet Union on the one side, and they've got Germany with a revanchist claim on the other side. And even the democratic governments of the Weimar Republic agreed to treaties in the middle of the 1920s that preserved the western frontier of Germany, but they didn't agree to the frontier on the eastern side, and they wanted to get Silesia back. So there's clearly a patriotic necessity of doing this, and that explains, I think, the fiscal dominance part. But there's a third element that I think is also crucial, in that, and we can think of it in parallel to fiscal dominance, and my colleague Markus Brunnermeier wrote extensively about financial dominance, and that's the argument that the banking system and then the broader economy depends on credit, and it depends on the central bank keeping the interest rate low. And so in the extreme case of the German story, the interest rate is at 5% until the summer of 1922, when, already by then, the inflation rates are in the hundreds. So effectively, the central bank is giving a present to the financial system, is keeping the financial system alive, and keeping the economy alive, and keeping employment alive, because also, what you will say in each of these countries is that you can't allow a stabilization because a stabilization would produce an adjustment shock and you would get a lot of unemployment. And in that circumstance, the possibility of radicalization, remember the Soviet Union is there and the Soviet model is there for export. And in 1919, in Hungary and Germany, there were Soviet republics. In Budapest, in Munich, in Bremen, Soviet communist attempted a revolution at the beginning of 1919 in Berlin. So it's real. So you need to keep this up, and that's the story that the banks and the businesses will tell, why the central bank needs to keep on helping them, why you need to get financial support, and the central bank is not only just doing it to the government, that's the second of those things, the fiscal dominance, but it's the financial dominance that comes as well. With the higher degree of inflation, you get an increasing amount of social disintegration. And I think that's well known, but it's worth emphasizing that what happens in the middle of an inflation, of a hyperinflation, is that it generates suspicion. And remember this beautiful story that Pierre just gave us of the wages being paid at the beginning of the day and the little children running out to buy things from the shops. Well, everybody in that story is worried that they're going to lose out, they're going to be cheated. So if the child is too slow, the shopkeeper will have already put the prices up, and the child will be feeling cheated, and the parents will be very angry with the child in the evening. If the child arrives there earlier, the shopkeeper will feel that the child is cheating them and that they've paid the money too quickly. So it's full of the attempted swindling of other people. So everybody is having to do things very, very quickly. You're thinking always you're taking advantage of somebody. So, when we normally in a society with stable prices, when we go into a shop and we buy something, we get something that we like and the shopkeeper gets some money that they like, and that's good. So we have a system where both sides in an arrangement win. In this inflationary situation, everybody is suspicious, and clearly in all of these cases, in Austria, in Hungary, in Germany, in Poland, the hyperinflationary episode is also accompanied by the rise in targeting specific minorities. So it's accompanied with the rise of anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism plays obviously a terrible, devastating role in these societies in the interwar period, but it begins in large part because of this story in the inflation. I think that's well known. Elias Canetti wrote very, very beautifully, elegantly on this question. But what's less well known is, I think, a phenomenon that is particularly true, particularly powerful in federal countries. So in federal countries that experience inflationary episodes, if you think of the mechanism of how financial dominance works, financial dominance is when the central bank effectively gives a handout to banks. But not all banks get that. Not all businesses get that. And in a federal country, the suspicion is that the institutions, the banks and the businesses that are really close to the center get a better deal. And so in 1923, in particular, as the German inflation really surges, in Bavaria, in Saxony, in the Rhineland, people say the central authorities are doing us down. We need to get an alternative. And in Saxony, it moved in a radical left-wing direction, and they had the Red Hundreds for a time in Saxony. In Bavaria, it moved in a radical right direction, and the height of that was the Hitler Putsch, it was at the time better known as the Ludendorff Putsch, because the other person who took a part in it was the great soldier from the First World War, General Erich Ludendorff. In the Rhineland, it went in a different direction, and they said we would be better off working with France. So let's have a separate Rhinish Republic working with the French. So the feeling that the central bank is only susceptible to appeals from people who are well connected and in Berlin is a powerful disintegrator of the authority of the central state. And in the late months of 1923, Germany came close to falling apart. If you go to the 1980s, the late 1980s and the early 1990s, you can see even clearer examples where the states did disintegrate. So there are many reasons why Yugoslavia broke up, many reasons why the Soviet Union broke up. But the story of Croatia and Slovenia thinking that they are being exploited by Belgrade is part of the story of the disintegration of the Yugoslav Federation. The Soviet Union, very, very similar, that it's people in Moscow who have the advantages, and if you're somewhere else, you don't have the advantages. So let me come to one other element before I conclude. Recently, there was a nice IMF paper by a group of authors looking at 100 inflation shocks. And what they find is a phenomenon that I think is an interesting phenomenon and is worth thinking about in our study of inflations and hyperinflations, of premature celebrations. So, it's easy to think that you have overcome the problem when you do the fiscal stabilization. And if the outside authority comes in and it reorganizes things and it looks good, it may not last. Actually, I think one of the most powerful cases of that is the story of the Grabski stabilization in 1924. It's a beautiful case study of a premature celebration, because what Grabski did was to say the value of the new coin, the new currency that would be introduced, that had already been there as a virtual currency since 1919. So the first banknotes are already printed but not issued. The Swati banknotes, the new Polish currency, are printed in 1919. But the new Swati will be arranged, and you can understand how it was done if you think about Hugo's presentation at the beginning of the morning, that the value of the Swati was set in 1924 as the value of the Swiss franc, because the Swiss franc was the one currency that hadn't been devalued during the war. So they do that. But the regime comes under attack because the Germans start a trade war against Poland, and the Polish exports collapse. And there's a substantial then attack on the stabilized currency. And in that circumstance, the ministry says, can the central bank intervene to stop the currency deteriorating? And the central bank refuses to do that and actually brings the Grabski administration down, and the Swati falls. And there's only a new stabilization in 1926, when the political circumstances change, and in the face of a deteriorating currency and a continued security threat, Marshal Piłsudski takes power. And what happens is then that political reordering creates the circumstances in which there can be a new stabilization. And this time, it's done with an American loan. So the stabilization on one's own hasn't worked as beautifully as Vladislav Grabski believed that it would do. Let me just conclude with an analysis of Poland, an external analysis that the brilliant, rather eccentric foreign expert of the Bank of England, Harry Siepman, gave in the middle of the Great Depression. And I think it's illustrative and indicative of the kind of political issue that comes about in the stabilization moment. So Siepman thinks of Poland on the whole as a success, and it is a success in the sense that it didn't have a big banking run in the 1931, in the moment that the German and the Austrian and the Hungarian banks collapsed. So none of that. Public mentality seems to be much less troublesome than in any other country. Their boom was short and came late, and they now look upon 1928 as having been the exceptional time. So they're more ready to regard present conditions as approaching the normal period. There is none of that readiness which one finds in Germany to consider that the present state of affairs represents a lapse from what any decent people are entitled to expect. Perhaps what has a good deal to do with all this is the fact that to all intents and purposes, in Poland, there are no politics. It makes the point, I think, that you've already heard from Pierre, that politics are really at the core of it, and that thinking about how to get a stabilization involves a great deal of political negotiation, and that doing things on one's own is a fragile and fraught process. It's helpful often to have the international stabilizers. And thank you.
May I ask Harold to take place on the podium and Pierre to join? We have a few minutes for questions to both speakers. Who wants to be the icebreaker? It's always the most difficult position. So if you don't have any question, I have an icebreaker question because I'm used to, oh, I don't have to use mine, yeah. Is there anywhere a microphone that we could use?
I can try to speak up.
Oh, good.
It's probably best for the recording to.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Harold James about regional disintegration. You mentioned the cases of Yugoslavia and you mentioned the case of Germany, but I think there maybe it's taking a little too far. Of course, hyperinflation never helps, but those states have been federal or unstable in the first place. I mean, you have that different, I don't know how to call them, different people in Yugoslavia, Croatians, Serbians, they never got along, not even before. And Germany Germany started only in 1871, and it was a much federal state. The Kaiserreich was much more federal than anyone likes to believe. And when we're then talking the 1920s and 1930s, yeah. So my question is, did you notice this kind of regional disintegration, for example, also in Argentina, Zimbabwe, or Hungary? Much more homogeneous states, in my view.
Well, yes. I mean, you know, obviously Hungary is smaller. Argentina, maybe Federico would like to talk about that. But let me come back to the point that you made at the beginning. You're absolutely right. Of course, that's why they're potentially liable to disintegrate. But you know, it is, I think, a powerful lesson for the present. If you think of Europe with a common monetary regime as essentially also composed of countries that are very, very different, you know, that's a situation in which very, very high levels of inflation will indeed drive Europe apart from each other. And so, you know, this is why this is not just of hypothetical interest, but why it's, I think, you know, currently central issue. But I think you could make exactly the same point about the United States. And, you know, the United States is a very, very big country, but it has very different regions in it and with different social identities as well. And you can think of inflationary regimes as being a solvent for those. But yes, I mean, if you would be in a, you go to the other end of the spectrum and say, what does inflation do for you in Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania or Slovenia? No, I don't think it would produce that kind of solvent. But Argentina, I think, is an interesting case because a lot of Argentine politics revolves around the difference between Buenos Aires and the rest of the country.
We have two more questions. So Bridget first, and then Federico.
Maybe it is not a very appropriate question at the hyperinflation conference, but I have to take advantage that you are here and Harold knows German economic history so well. You were quite clear that the hyperinflation was really disintegrating Germany and preparing the ground for what came in the 30s. But may I ask you whether the deflation period around the Great Depression, 29-30, was not more painful and was the game changer in bringing the Nazis to power?
Well, I mean, the answer to that, as to almost any difficult question, is yes and no. Yes, I mean, obviously it was the Great Depression that brought Hitler to power. And, I still remember my PhD defense because the first sentence in my PhD said it was the Great Depression that produced a Nazi government in Germany. And the examiners found this very controversial and spent 1 hour of the defense talking about my first sentence. But the problem is that in many ways what the inflation did creates the vulnerabilities that then get exposed by the Great Depression. And so, I mean, this story of suspicion and anti-Semitism included is something that really clearly has its origins in the Great Inflation. I mean, it goes back earlier, and again, the first question might be interesting. Of course, there was anti-Semitism in Germany before the First World War, but on the whole, when people compared anti-Semitism in Germany and the United States before the First World War, they thought that there was more in the United States. So, what happens is that hyperinflation really changes this. And hyperinflation also destroys the capitalization of the banks when they try to get reestablished. They're doing it on a very thin capital basis. They're very vulnerable as a consequence of that. If I go back to the Polish example, the reason that Poland isn't so vulnerable is that it has big state banks. It's also this is the 100th anniversary of Big EK, of the big Polish state bank. So this creates less vulnerability. But the vulnerabilities of the Depression era arise out of the inflation, and then they arise also out of the way that the inflation is solved. Because as long as the money is flowing from the United States, Germany looks really quite secure and quite prosperous. When there's what we now call a sudden stop and a reversal of the capital flows, then it's a hopeless situation. And that vulnerability to sudden stops is one of the legacies of the inflation and of the way that it was solved politically.
Next question is for Federico Sturzenegger. The micro is already there.
Sorry, didn't see it. No, just a comment on this question on federalism and hyperinflation. For you. I'm answering to you. Okay. It's the relationship between hyperinflation and federalism. In the case of Argentina, the relationship between the central government and provinces is a key factor. But surprisingly, when you have hyperinflation, there's no tension in that dimension, because somehow the provinces, one way or the other, they share on the inflation tax and it's transferred to that. So we have had tensions there. But we've had tensions in the opposite, in the moments of monetary stringency. Like, for example, at the end of the 1990s, when we had a convertibility regime, and at some point there was under strain and people kind of wanted their dollars and there was a huge monetary contraction, so very, very tight monetary condition, then provinces decided to issue their own currencies So they started issuing kind of their fiat currencies, and so at some point we had like 25 currencies. There's reputably once Paul Volcker came to advise the president, and he basically, after being an afternoon arriving in Buenos Aires, he asked for an emergency meeting with the president the following morning at 8 o'clock. So the president says, what's going on with this guy? This guy says, look, I came here yesterday. I realized you have 25 currencies in this country. When you have one, call me, okay? And maybe I can tell you something. So, and actually the same thing is happening right now. Because right now the government has really tightened monetary policy very dramatically, very quickly. And a few months ago, one of the provinces under this strain of resources decided also to pay the employees with some kind of government bond, which is a sort of currency. So I think that federalism and inflation, at least in the case of Argentina, is kind of a more relevant issue under the deflation than under the hyperinflation. That's maybe what I would go.
I would like to close this session with a question to Pierre, which intrigued me when he talked about hyperinflation in Hungary. So with 45 and 46, there is this hyperinflation. 48, Hungary gets taken over by Russia and becomes basically a dominion of the Soviet Union. So the fact that hyperinflation was there, does it loosen the political stability to that extent that the country falls?
Well, keep in mind that the architects of the stabilization 46 would be prominent members of the subsequent regime. So you may have an official date, let's call it a 48, but the mechanisms and the people who would actually bring about the end of the hyperinflation were the architects, were already in place. Mm-hmm. And they clearly understood what was needed to end the hyperinflation, as I said. They understood, even though they wouldn't use the term credibility, but they understood what was necessary for credibility. And as Harold pointed out, they had some outside help. The fact that the Americans allowed the gold to come back, the fact that they were able to stockpile food to make sure there was plenty of food when the forint was introduced. Now, there were some countercurrents because the Soviets were beginning to dismantle all the industrial infrastructure, but the impact of those things would happen much later. So it's important to remember that the people who would take over were already in place. And so you shouldn't focus on 48. You should focus on the people who were there and who instituted the reforms.
Okay, thank you. So with this, we close the first session. As I warned you, your coffee shot has to wait for 2 or 3 minutes for the group photo, which we do under the guidance of our photographer. And I would like you to be back here 10:55. 10:55. despite tremendous efforts, so we were not able to catch up with our backlog, but at least we were in the beginning of the conference 10 minutes late. Now we are only 9 minutes late, so that's already an effort. We continue now with the second session, and that is opened by Moritz Kramer. As I said, so he has many years in a senior position at Standard & Poor's, and he's going to talk about hyperinflation in emerging markets, and that will be immediately followed by Federico Sturzenegger, the former governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, and how also advises President Milei in his reforms. Moritz, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much. This is a wonderful room, wonderful event, and a wonderful topic. And hopefully this will remain firmly in the realm of economic historians. And everything that we do here is out of backward-looking interest only. So I will try to set you off, give you a little bit of a survey, of a roundup of what have we seen in terms of inflation and hyperinflation in emerging markets since World War II. This sounds like a pretty easy task, but actually I found it was much harder than I had feared, partly because of the information, availability of data, and so on. So let's see. Before we start, I want some bragging rights for my own, not stamp collection in this case, but my banknote collection. This is the highest denomination that I own. It's not worth very much on eBay because that's where I bought it. So this is $100 trillion. They didn't spend too much thought on the design of the bill either, I think. Just three stones on top of each other. But of course, the all-time trophy for the highest denomination goes to our host country, Hungary. I don't know whether this is correct, but this is what my research told me, that this is the biggest denomination of any bill ever printed, and officially in circulation. It's 100 quintillion. That's I don't even know how many zeros that has. 20 apparently, because that's... So here we go. So, and that's even without the stamps that Pierre told us about, that would then further devalue the properties. But none of this is really useless in the strict sense. You can always make the most of it. And this is what we see on this picture. This is a part of an exhibit that was recently shown in Frankfurt on the 100th anniversary of the hyperinflation there. So this is a lady who wears a dress out of banknotes. So you could either put it in the chimney, but in the summer you can use it as a nice dress and go out, rather than trying to spend it. So this is a fashion statement, but let's move away from fashion back to economics. So we've been enjoying low inflation, great moderation. We all know the story and the labels. Until relatively recently, when inflation picked up, it looks like the genie is partly being pushed back into the bottle, but it's very timely that we talk about inflation, because inflation was a non-subject for so many years. And now we see that in both high, low, and middle-income countries, inflation has been picking up. But that's not what we're here to discuss. We're talking about hyperinflation here. So let's talk about really high inflation episodes. And I've been doing my best to count all high inflation episodes. Of course, hyperinflation in the Kagan definition, 50% per month. So some of them, like the yellow line, is much milder. It only is 100%. These are year-on-year inflation rates. And you can see this is actually a very sort of unevenly distributed phenomenon. And most of it, and I'll go into some more detail, happens in the early 1990s. But then, of course, people like lists and hit parades. So this is the record that I could find on hyperinflation. Zimbabwe was particularly difficult to find anything. So this is my little artificial intelligence assistant came up with that. I don't know whether that is true. It's apparently 89 sextillion
So we had this conversation on the table last night. How do you even measure prices like this? I mean, the prices become pretty much meaningless. But this is what we find. Yugoslavia is sort of ranked second and third, and then it goes. It's pretty unimpressive, Zimbabwe and Venezuela in comparison, but still. So these are the rates, and you can see also at the near end here in 2020 onwards that also not only inflation overall has increased, but very high inflation has increased as well. Now let's unpack that a little bit further. This is inflation above 100% year on year. Again, by hyperinflation standards, not overly impressive, but I've been trying to show also where does this actually occur, in which regions of the world. And again, we see this pattern. It's going steeply up in around 1990. And it's mostly a phenomenon then of Europe and Asia. But when I say Asia, it's really the states emerging out of the Soviet Union. So don't think Indonesia or don't think Thailand. These are all the stans that fall into here. So this is, again, we had this lull, great moderation. Not a single country for several years between 2000 and 2015 or so had inflation above 100%. That's pretty amazing, actually. And then it picked up a little bit, but again, 100% is sort of below our standards here, isn't it? So let's go a little higher, 500%. This is the same chart for over 500%. Pretty similar picture. We see Europe again and Asia being the main regions of very high inflation. And then we go for the serious guys here, above 1,000% inflation per year. And so I put some labels there so that you can see who they are. Interestingly, when I did this, is actually that in the 60s, 70s, it's super rare. Now, of course, we had fixed exchange rates, and it only started in Latin America in the 1980s when we had the debt crisis there, which was triggered by the dual shock of terms of trade shock and an interest rate shock. It was pretty much a Latin American phenomenon. And in many people's minds, when they think about hyperinflation, at least in my generation, they still think about Latin America as like the typical region, but it's actually not. You look at where the hyperinflation episodes occurred, and you will find, again, much of it is blue. That's the European side. And there you have sort of the European contingent of the former Soviet Union, plus the various Yugoslavias of the world. And this has been short and sharp, and then it disappeared again. So this is one of the conclusions that I will present in a moment. These things happen in times of great turmoil. You know, every now and then we have, I mean, Brazil was a repeat offender here. Don't know whether there's anyone from Brazil in the room who wants to elaborate. But other than that, Latin America is pretty much out of the picture until the Chavistas came back and created hyperinflation in Venezuela. Since in the most sort of recent episodes, you know, once the dust settled over the collapse of Yugoslavia, over the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's been very rare, and it's been mostly in Africa, mostly in Zimbabwe actually, and then you have throw in Sudan, you had a little bit of Angola, but it's become relatively rare recently, and I mean recently, starting with this millennium. So, what triggered hyperinflation? We've heard already quite a few remarks on that. The main actor in this game, in this play, is political instability, is the breakup of the social order, and sometimes in the collapse of nations or a coup or civil wars. So you could see this obviously, Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. These are the most numerous hyperinflation episodes in the last half century. Military dictatorships. We hear a little bit more about Argentina, I presume, from Federico in a moment, so I'm not going to go there. Very often this had to do, I mean, we have coups and military dictatorships because there is turmoil, there is the lack of social cohesion, and this is being papered over with deficits which are then monetized and so on. And even when you remember the first, let's just go back here quickly, Indonesia was the first episode of hyperinflation post-war that I found. This was also not coming out of the blue, but this was actually an insurgency that the Sukarno regime was battling at the time in Indonesia. Zimbabwe, why Zimbabwe? Why not Uganda? Why not any other country? Well, my explanation is the social rupture happened when the Mugabe government pretty much sort of expropriated all the white farmers. That meant that what used to be the breadbasket of Africa suddenly became unproductive. You had shortage of food. You had a great sort of tension in the society, and this led again to the temptation: let's spend more, let's print the money, and the rest is not history. Unfortunately, it's still there largely. So Sudan, similar. So war, civil war or war with other nations, a typical main actor here, and it goes back to history. I give you a few examples here, from the 30-year war to the War of Succession. This is when inflation happens, and this is when hyperinflation is being supported. So there are supporting actors as well, so beyond the social political sphere, and that has to do with intransparency. So there was another label on it earlier. I think it was you, Harold, who said like corruption. Yes, so that helps. That's a supporting actor, but that's not the main actor. And then you have just bad luck, like terms of trade shocks can trigger that. These are, when I look at all these episodes, like the recurring themes. So that it's not a total surprise when you will have a hyperinflation, but there are certain patterns to it. Now, why are we seeing fewer hyperinflations recently? I remember this peak in the early 90s. Well, the obvious answer to begin with is that we have fewer of those episodes, like the breakdown of states, like Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union since then. We have some of them. You know, Sudan was one of the last hyperinflation episodes. That's also a country that did break up. But by and large, so the world used to be, at least, or has been more stable since the tumultuous period around 1990, when many of the maps, especially in Europe and Central Asia, were redrawn. So that's, you know, the famous book that we all remember, The End of History, Francis Fukuyama. Well, maybe not so fast, so history seems to be back. So we'll in the outlook, we'll come to that, whether maybe this was just an atypical lull of calm, or whether we're potentially going forward maybe seeing more situations which are fertile ground for hyperinflationary developments. The second reason why I think there is less episodes of hyperinflation more recently is that people remember. And this was also already elaborated on this morning. And in another IMF working paper that came out recently, they basically conclude that individuals, or societies, I should say, that have lived through inflationary episodes, they're more concerned about inflation, which is sort of not very surprising. But this memory has some sort of deterrent effects on policymakers, because it's not popular. So there's more pushback. But of course, memory will fade. And one interesting observation for me as a German citizen is when we had this high inflation, by our standards at least, in 22, 23, people were always sort of caricaturing the Germans as being obsessed with hyperinflationary memory, etc. I actually thought that the reaction was pretty calm and not very different from the reaction in other countries that had high inflation. So the memory fades, which often is a good thing, because there are many things that we don't want to remember. But this inoculation against high inflation works for a while, and maybe a generation or two. And if you look at those spikes at hyperinflation, that's like a generation or two ago. So maybe the memory fades and this instinctive repelling of inflationary risks may also wane, and the fact that we have discussions about let's look at the inflation target, maybe that's too low, maybe 3%, 4%, 5% is better. So that may be just a symptom of that inflationary memory fading in some people's minds. We were also lucky, point 3, that we've had fewer terms of trade shocks compared to, to the past. Some of the like the Latin American hyperinflation episodes were, of course, the consequence indirectly of the oil price shock because that led to inflation in the US and that led Paul Volcker to hike up interest rates, and the debt in Latin America and elsewhere was denominated in US dollar, was typically short-term. Those were bank loans and not bonds. So this transmission mechanism of higher oil prices led to these episodes in Latin American countries. As a consequence of these crises, the Latin American debt crisis, the Asian crisis, the famous, or some would say infamous, Washington Consensus took root, which was very much sort of an orthodox policy prescription, which again makes it much more likely that high inflation episodes are being avoided. But it's clear to see for all of us that this consensus is crumbling in many instances, and that there is much more willingness to go with heterodox experiments more recently. What I observe, number 5, is that countries also get much better at managing their debt. For example, I said the Latin American debt crisis, in most countries, all of the debt was foreign, was denominated in US dollars, and was rather short term. As a consequence of the resolution of this crisis, we have made great strides in improving the debt management practices. Many of the countries that fell into a debt trap back then are now actually have overcome original sin, meaning they can borrow long term in their own currencies at decent rates. There's much more professionalism, and as I will point out, there's also much more transparency about what's going on. And transparency is part of the protection against policy mistakes, also in the fiscal monetary era. Data has gotten much better. So when I did my PhD I was on the Mexican debt crisis, and now you can sort of calculate back how old I must be, but I was looking at data from the Banco de Mexico. I think it was interest rates or something like that, or the foreign direct investment. And what would you do today? You open your laptop or smartphone and look it up. Now, back then, guess what? There was no laptop, there was no smartphone, there was no internet. You basically had to call them, and they say, "Can you send me this?" Yeah, we'll fax it to you. When is the last time you got a fax? I don't know. But this was like high technology at the time. And so I was coming to my office every morning and waiting for this fax to arrive. Look, the first thing it was really important for my work. So it's remarkable. I don't even remember what type of data it was, but memories fade, as we just discussed. So yes, it wasn't coming. I was getting rather nervous, and one morning I see all this thermal paper like curled up on the floor, and this was the fax from Mexico City, and I could read almost everything because the fax machine, sometimes the lines were not exactly sort of aligned. And this is sort of what data availability looked like at the time. It was really hard. Today, anyone can look up almost any data at any point in time. So that, again, makes opacity and intransparency much harder, and that reduces the room for committing policy mistakes being unnoticed or being sort of in the shadows. So price signals have also increased. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. And capital controls are less common than they used to be. All of these factors contribute to an environment where hyperinflation is much harder to pull off, even if you tried. And no one tries that deliberately, of course. Always the consequence of good intentions, patriotism, and all the rest that we just heard. But the environment for hyperinflation to emerge is much less positive than it used to be. Let's start with, there are more signals, price signals. One of it is the exchange rate. This is the, at least though, the formal legal form of the exchange rate regimes over time among member countries of the IMF. And we're coming from a world pretty much with a pegged exchange rate, Bretton Woods and all the rest of it, to one where we had many more flexible exchange rates. And exchange rates, of course, give you price signals. So you can't do things under the cover of a fixed exchange rate. If there is suspicion that something unsustainable is going to go on, the exchange rate will move. You didn't have that in the 70s and 80s so much as you have today. But you can also see the high point of floating exchange rate is already behind us. Maybe that's also part of what I described earlier, that the Washington consensus is sort of a little bit on the retreat. But even so, we have many more exchange rate regimes which give us early warning signals. There's something fishy going on here. Let's look more closely. And that is something that we didn't have in the past to the same extent. So more price signals via the exchange rate. We have more price signals via bonds. I just described the 1980s Latin American debt crisis when Mexico declared that they won't pay, the famous Mexican weekend. I think it was in August 1982. The debt was to US money center banks. And that's it. There were no bonds. And so no one could really see how bond prices would move, because it was all in the risk departments of a handful of banks in Manhattan and some in Tokyo as well. So this has changed dramatically. This shows you the number of sovereign ratings in the world. And before the 1988, it was pretty much like the AAA, the G7s. You know, they had like unsolicited ratings. So this from S&P, but you could look at the same thing from Moody's and Fitch. It would look pretty similar. So what happened in 1988 was the Brady Plan. So the Latin American debt was converted from bank loans into bonds, which then were tradable, and you could have insurance companies, pension funds, or you and I, we could invest suddenly in Brazilian and Mexican bonds, which we couldn't do before. And in order to do so, they needed a rating. So there's more transparency through bond prices, because bonds now exist, which they didn't before. And rating agencies, whatever you may think of their performance, they actually look at this. And they give signals in terms of, hang on, there may be something going in the wrong direction. Before, you didn't have that. No one gave any signs of warning. And if you look at the distribution of ratings, you will see that the yellow bars, which are the low-rated, low investment grade, B category, is now the most numerous of them all. So we have many, many more signals coming here, and of course many more controversies. And well, this rating action was wrong. And I've heard this many times. I was for almost 20 years at S&P. But at least you have this discussion. Before, you didn't have that because there was no signal that you could even discuss. So many more information points, data points, early warning signals. That makes hyperinflation less likely because you get a warning earlier on before things actually start to unravel entirely. We're also lucky. So we didn't have terms of trade shock comparable to the 1970s oil shock, where we had for decades stable and low prices, and suddenly this went up sixfold. And of course, as I described, inflation went up in the US. Paul Volcker arrived, and one of the unintended consequences was a global debt crisis. We did have spikes in oil prices, yes, but they were usually more temporary. And also, we are much less dependent on energy in terms of what is the share of GDP. So these shocks haven't recurred. And that's good luck, partly, but that's also good policy that we have more diversified economies, less dependent on oil. So data is getting better. So I'm showing you here a couple of countries that wouldn't normally be considered like best performers in terms of transparency, but just counting here, what are the number of world development indicators that the World Bank in its database collects that are available for a number of countries. And you can see this goes from like Senegal, Mauritania, and so on, so not really sort of big players on the international capital market by any stretch of the imagination, but even there, the information availability is improving gradually and continuously. So you could see that in the 1990s, there were maybe 500 or 600 data points available in this data set, and now it's over 1,000. So, you know, there's more data, there's more things to look at, and the timeliness is getting better as well. So this overcomes partly this supporting actor of intransparency that contributes to hyperinflation. Very important in my mind is, and that's related partly to the more floating exchange rate regimes, we have more open balance of payments, so you have more convertibility. And here you see these are the IMF numbers that have accepted the obligations under Article 8, which pretty much gives you sort of the commitment to avoid cross-border payments for current transactions. So you have much more free flow of capital across borders, and when you have that, you have another early warning signal, which is called capital flight, which whereas the money is trapped with financial repression, you don't have that. And there's a huge increase, and you can see that. This is sort of the Washington consensus effect, if you like, in the mid-90s. And it's now 90% of all IMF members actually have underwritten the obligations under Article 8 of the IMF. So that is a far cry from what we had in the 1970s and 1980s. This gives us protection against such grave policy mistakes that would lead to hyperinflation, because the money could and would leave the country normally. And I haven't done the analysis, but I would be pretty sure that the countries that have recently had hyperinflation are not among those that have underwritten Article 8. So that's actually something which sounds pretty obscure, but is quite important. So all these things are good. On the negative side of the ledger, if you remember that the main actor is actually political turmoil, is war, civil war, we're seeing in recent years an increase in conflicts. And it's not necessarily like the war and the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. Most of these conflicts tend to be more internal. So it's only the red sliver, that's actually interstate war, that's Russia, Ukraine. It's pretty rare. Most of the troubles are more of the Yugoslavia type, you know, where sort of cohesion of a country is under threat. And if we look at the trend, it's clearly going up. So maybe this lull where we had all these favorable things, you know, more transparency, less social troubles, less animosity in the world, that this is coming to an end, and maybe we will see a continuation on the trend that I've shown you, that there are more and more smaller countries, admittedly, that have hyperinflationary periods, because this has been the main contributor in the past, and social conflict is back on the agenda. And this is a little greeting from our legal department. After you've consumed all of this, and it's actually in German, so it's very good. So I've been thinking very hard when I prepared this slide, you can see. So I think we'll keep questions for later. I think Federico, you will be on the stage next. Thank you very much, and see you in a moment over there.
Do I have my slides? Okay. There we go. Perfect. Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation from the Central Bank of Hungary. I was delighted when I heard this morning the Deputy Governor speak about how the Central Bank had held its ground on the inflation targets, and how that was so substantially important to keep the credibility and keep expectations anchored. And I can tell you out of personal experience, because at the end of 2017, when I was governor of the central bank, the executive branch of the government in Argentina decided to change the inflation targets, and I tell you, it's a total disaster. So sometimes when the central banks keep their ground, hold their ground in spite of what politicians do. They're actually defending the politician. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So I was delighted to see that the Central Bank of Hungary has done that. Okay, so I was a little bit surprised, to be honest, about the topic of hyperinflations. You know, we've been talking about deflation and low inflation in the world for a number of years. So, but certainly, it absolutely makes sense to call, what do you do if you're going to talk about hyperinflation? You call someone from Argentina, okay? If you don't call someone from Argentina, it's like doing a cake without the flour. I mean, it's kind of, wouldn't make any sense. And also because Argentines are so prone to monetary experiments, you know, that the economist wrote, there's no people like the Argentines which love to experiment with monetary policy. And this was written in The Economist in 1891, okay? And you see that in Argentina, some things are very stable. We kind of keep at it, okay? So we keep inventing things, okay? Now, you see that my presentation is called The Future of Hyperinflations, okay? I'm going to tell you that hyperinflations are here among us. So I leave that as a kind of a little bit of a surprise statement. I don't know if you've seen this series called Succession. I mean, it plays here in Hungary, Succession. Okay, so there's a character, the main character is called Roy Logan, okay? And at some point they asked Roy about the future, and then he says, well, the only real thing is the future. The history, that's the past, that's just a bunch of histories, okay? I was a little bit reluctant to tell the story to a bunch of historians, but anyway, that's why I said we're going to talk about the future of hyperinflations, okay? So I think the other reason they invited me is that given my age, I've actually lived in hyperinflation. So you know the little kid that Pierre was talking about? I was that little kid. So I'll tell you the story just in a little while, okay? So, but let me start by kind of going through a number of recent hyperinflations in Argentina, okay? So the first one I want to mention is in the mid-70s. You see that here we actually, this by the way are monthly inflation rates, what you're going to see here. You see that this episode does not really kind of meet the bar of the Kagan, remember the 50%, but this was particularly important for the Argentines because this came after many, many years of stability. We had never kind of, it's not that we had kind of low inflation, but we never had episodes like this. This was an episode that everybody remembers in Argentina because it was a period of time in which whole families lost all their assets because people were unprepared for this hyperinflation, okay, for this very high inflation. So it started kind of around the middle of 1975, inflation 35%. You see it stayed high for quite some time. So this was kind of our first encounter with a dramatic situation of high inflation. Now, the real thing actually happened towards the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. So I was a relatively young guy here. In about July of 1989, inflation rate reached 200% in 1 month. Okay, so I lived through this experience, and it was quite amazing. You would go to the supermarket in the morning, you would go to the supermarket in the afternoon, and honestly, the prices were different, and you felt it, you sensed it. I have a funny story that at the time one day I had to buy a floppy disk. This reveals your age, okay? So, you know, before drive, before the pen drive, okay. So we had a floppy disk. So I walk into a store and I told the guy I need to buy a floppy disk. And the guy kind of looks at me, you know. And you see the guy is assessing me and says, okay, I have the floppy disk, he says. Okay, how much is the floppy disk? He says, no, let's do the following. I'll give you the floppy disk. And when all this mess ends, you come back and pay it, okay? But I cannot give you a price today for the floppy disk because, I mean, it means nothing for me. So the credit of a stranger walking into the store was more than the credit that the monetary policy had on keeping the value of the currency. Of course, that always didn't happen. What happened is that people just closed the stores and didn't sell anything, you know? And you had the sign in the front of the store which said, closed for lack of prices. Okay, so you didn't have a price, you just can't sell. So these recessions have this big contractionary that Pierre you showed in the case of some other experiences. Okay, so that was a big thing, 200% inflation, and then it kind of subsided for a few months, and then a few months later we had a second hyperinflation. So, I mean, the two combined to provide a good memory, but the first one apparently had not been enough for us, okay? And this is where I was Pierre's little boy, because I remember that one day I was home, and my mother had collected the wage of my father, and he gave me the bills, and he said, Federico, go to La Plata. La Plata was the city where we lived in Argentina, and you buy dollars. I don't care the price. And if you don't buy the dollars, don't care to come back, okay? So I had to buy. It didn't matter why. Okay, so as a little boy, I went out and kind of tried to find the dollars to get rid of these bloody bills, which we kind of all got very crazy. And then the inflation rate went up to 90% in 1 month. And so that's my experience. Now, after those two very large inflation episodes, Argentina instituted a currency board and actually kind of went into a period of very low inflation. Towards the end of the 90s, we were placed in exactly the opposite position than we had been before, in the sense that the currency board came under attack. People decided they didn't trust the peso any longer, so they went to this currency board to exchange their peso for dollars, and that led to a huge contraction in the monetary base. So at the end of the 1990s, Argentina was experiencing deflation, okay? So we had gone from hyperinflation to deflation, okay? So you see that we keep experimenting, you know, we like the variety. And when we had this very strong monetary contraction, what happened was not only, as I mentioned earlier today, the provinces started issuing their own currency, they started paying their employees with some bonds, but actually the bond had the shape of a bill, correct? And people could trade and use that as currency. But some people started issuing private money. So what started happening is that you established what are called barter. This was kind of the 90s versions of cryptocurrencies, okay? So you basically have barter clubs, and you said, okay, let's kind of do trading in this neighborhood, in this market. Let's establish this market, and we're going to issue a currency to be traded in this market. So suddenly, a number of private currencies appeared, and I'm showing you here some pictures of some of that. So these are clubes de trueque, trading clubs, and if you go in there, you would be given these coupons, and these coupons were denominated in currency, and you could use them as cash, okay? So basically what we had at the end of the 1990s is an interesting experiment of private monetary expansion, kind of substituting the big monetary contraction which was happening at the level of the official peso. Okay, so you have a picture there of, say, a trading club. This was typically in relatively low-income neighborhoods. So there was a guy who was actually printing money, correct? And people didn't really know how much they're printing, how much seigniorage they were collecting. They were certainly sharing the seigniorage with the participants of the market. Some had rules, some didn't have rules. So you had a variety of private currencies which emerged in Argentina at the end of the 1980s in this deflation period. So this is kind of quite interesting. You have okay, so what happened is that when monetary, so at the end, eventually, the monetary contraction was so big, the recession was so big that kind of the political system cracked, and Argentina left its fixed exchange rate and kind of resumed kind of an independent monetary policy for good and for bad. And monetary policy was normalized on the official peso, and then people decided at some point that the official peso, if you had it, was more efficient than having these things that you can only trade, this money that you could only trade in one particular market, in one particular neighborhood. So the official peso quickly drove out the demand for these private currencies. So these private currencies all had hyperinflations, correct? When a particular unit of payment loses demand, people don't want to use it anymore. They want to get rid of it at whatever, I mean, and to get whatever they can in terms of goods. That means that the value of that currency is coming down, that currencies are having a hyperinflation. So in 2002, as monetary conditions normalized in Argentina, all these privately held currencies had a hyperinflation. They were wiped out, they lost complete value. This is why I'm saying that hyperinflation is with us, because remember it was last year or the year before that we had a cryptocurrency which crashed and kind of came down to zero? Well, that cryptocurrency had a hyperinflation, correct? It had a value and suddenly the value fell to zero. That's a hyperinflation, okay? So basically I want to introduce the dimension of the hyperinflations, not on the official currencies, which is what we all the time think about, okay? Let's think about the hyperinflations on the alternative to official currency. So my presentation is going to be focused, what rest of my presentation is going to focus on this, which I hope you find it's at least different, okay? So look at this. This is the number of people who were using in Argentina this private money. So you see, I don't know if I have a laser here pointer, I guess I don't see it, but you see here how kind of towards the end of 2001, it increased, and then suddenly in about a year, all these currencies had disappeared. So in 2002, all these currencies had a hyperinflation, okay? So this is a paper in the JME which kind of experienced it. And look at here. This is, you see this number here? This is the money, the growth of the money stock in 2001 in Argentina, which was minus 20% nominal, okay? So this is kind of in this moment of very stringent monetary conditions, you had this huge increase in the amount of people using these private currencies. No? Okay, and this is Argentina last year, because we kind of keep at it, okay? We just can't learn, okay? So this is last year. So last year we had a government which had kind of an extremely high fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit was financed fully with inflation tax, with money printing. At the end of the year, the government will go ahead in an election. The government realized that it was going to lose the election, so they decided to wipe out the personal income tax as a way to prop up its popularity. So that all was transformed into money printing, and so we really kind of ran into a hyperinflation at the end of last year. What you have here is the consumer price index, and then you have the wholesale price index, which really goes above 50% in December of last year. Okay, so this is the environment in which the new government in Argentina had to take over. Okay. Okay, so if we think about let me just try to place these experiences of Argentina in the context of two ways of thinking about hyperinflations. Okay, so you can think of hyperinflation as, I think it was mentioned, when the government loses control of fiscal and monetary policy. Someone defined it that way earlier today. So you have this kind of process of fiscal dominance, huge money printing, and then you have hyperinflation. Now, for example, if I think of the European hyperinflations, I see countries which use a lot of money printing during the war. They have price controls. Eventually, you go to a market equilibrium, and this kind of monetary overhang generates this big jump in the price level. Okay? And I would say Argentina 1975 is very much of that nature. You had a large budget which was being financed with money printing. Argentina 89 had a big component of that, a large deficit which was financed with money printing. And Argentina 2023, I just mentioned. Okay? And then you have a different type of hyperinflation, which is, I'm going to call it the currency substitution type. It's like, if you think of the quantitative theory of money, M times V equal P times Q. So you can think that P is moving because M is moving or because V is moving, okay? So let's for a moment focus on V. Can we have a hyperinflation on the basis of V? Which actually was something that Kagan, he postulated this idea. Can we have a process of inflation where inflation increases, and because inflation increases and people reduce money demand, that increases prices further and blah, blah, blah. That leads you, okay? Kagan, of course, did not have a general equilibrium model to think how that kind of tied out eventually. That was done by Obstfeld and Rogoff in a GPA paper later on, but I'll show you in the next slide, okay? But the currency substitution, look, I put Argentina 89 also in both categories, okay? So in my second paper in my thesis at MIT, I mean, this is like Pierre, no? We're kind of going back to our old age. And actually, Pierre was the referee for that paper, okay? So basically, I look at the Argentinian 1989 hyperinflation, and I split how much of that hyperinflation was M and how much of that hyperinflation was V, okay? And I find that of the 200%, 100% was M, 100% was V. Okay, so that's why Argentina is in both places. Argentina 1990, which is when my mother sent me to buy the dollars, remember? This was all V, no M. So Argentina is one of the few countries that has had a hyperinflation with no money printing, okay? It was just that we just went berserk, okay? We just went crazy. I mean, people said inflation is coming, go buy the dollars and don't bother to come back if you don't find them, okay? So the 1990 hyperinflation in Argentina was in a moment in which the government was not printing money. It was just that kind of velocity just plummeted. I mean, just people got so scared given the memory they had had of the hyperinflation 6 months earlier. And the Argentina 2002 is a hyperinflation, which also comes from not the additional printing of these tokens, but by the fact that the demand for these tokens fell. This I'm referring to this private currency hyperinflations. Okay, so you see we have all kinds of experiments to talk about. Okay, so I want to focus about for a moment about this, the possibility of having hyperinflations both in private currencies, or whether the emergence of an alternative to official cash, like electronic money that people use and which is not issued by the government, can generate a process where the value that people associate to official money decreases. Okay, so this is the future of hyperinflation that I want to discuss. Okay, listen, I have this graph here. I'm at a central bank, so I can indulge myself, okay, and showing this kind of things. This is a graph which comes from that Opsel and Rogoff paper, which tries to put the Kagan intuition into a general equilibrium model, okay? So basically they build a Sidrowski model, and then they say, what are the monetary equilibriums here? And then you see there's an equilibrium of, given the expected rate of inflation, M star, and then you see that you have what you have on the vertical axis is a dynamic equation for M dot, okay? So you have two dynamics. One is to the left. If you go to an M which is larger than M star, you see that M dot is positive. This is a hyper-deflationary path. Okay, so this is a path where prices are falling and falling, and then the stock of money is growing, okay? At some point, we can rule out this path because at some point money becomes too big that people cannot continue accumulating money if there's so much money. But then I'm interested in the path to the left. You see that to the left, M dot is negative, correct? M dot is below 0, so it's negative. So that means that M is falling. That means that prices are increasing. Okay, so to the left, you have a hyperinflationary path. Okay, and the hyperinflationary path, you can have two types. You can have going to B or going to A. If you go to B, you can rule out that hyperinflationary path because at some point you go to a contradiction. The agent wants to continue reducing money and they cannot because M is 0. But if the path converges to 0, at 0, M, that's the self-fulfilling hyperinflation path of Kagan. Okay? Now, for the graph to converge to A, you need money not to be very essential. You need that you can substitute away very easily from money. If you cannot substitute away very easily from money, as inflation increases, you just kind of stop using the money, and then you converge to 0. If money is very essential, you cannot have the hyperinflationary path, okay? So the essence is there a risk that official currency may be substituted from something else? Okay, and this is what I just want to think about for a second, okay? So you have cash can be replaced by electronic money, cash can be replaced by a central bank digital currency. This is really kind of not key because these are different ways the central bank can offer money. And instead of cash, you use it electronic. It's kind of a little bit the same thing. But if you were to have cryptocurrencies, well, cryptocurrencies, and imagine that for a second that we have cryptocurrencies which are good and as efficient as cash, then why would people have the official currency as opposed to the cryptocurrency? So here we're in this world where the official money becomes less essential, okay? And remember that when we had the Silicon Valley mini crisis last year, the price of Bitcoin went up a lot. So it's kind of, people really like this currency holding instruments which are outside the system because they don't trust the system. So I think as a research point, I think it's something interesting to look at. But really, people don't use Bitcoin to buy the coffee in the coffee shop, okay? So Bitcoin really is not operative as a mean of payments. But I think it's pretty curious that, for example, Amazon has not issued a currency because Amazon in the US has people trading in the platform. So if Amazon were to use a currency, people could use that currency very, very naturally. So 2 years ago, Mercado Libre, which is kind of the equivalent of Amazon in Latin America, they said, how about if we issue a token and people buy with a token, which would be a currency issued by us? What should be the monetary policy of this token? Okay? And they have not launched it because they fear that the central banks will impede them to use this, but certainly the potential is there. Okay? And so I think it's more interesting that cryptocurrencies is basically the tokens and the currency that people who have trading platforms where people buy real goods and services can actually take life. And to be honest, as the world becomes more digital and we trade more online, etc., I think these are things that we'll have to think about, and I think central banks will have to think about these things a lot. Okay, so I told my assistant, why don't we look a little bit about what's happening with cash? If it's true that somehow these alternatives are kind of chipping away to the demand for central bank money, the money that central banks produce. So what you have here is circulation to GDP, all countries in the world. All countries in the world. So you see it has some seasonality. Then you have this big spike. What is this spike? 2020. So 2020 increased the amount of cash that people use. I'm not so sure why, because they couldn't go out, but anyway. And then you see that it has been converging back to zero. Okay, so we've had a process of reduction in the amount of cash, but we still don't know if this is a structural thing or it's just a reversal to the mean, okay? Here you have a particular number of cases, okay? So you have the US and you have Europe, then you have Brazil, then you have Hungary, because I was coming to Hungary, so I said put Hungary, and you have Argentina, okay? So the US and Europe are the two there on the top. The green line is Hungary. Quite interesting. You tell me what's happening. I don't know what's happening here, okay? But Hungary has been much more effective in reducing cash than the Eurozone and the US. And the same has happened with Brazil. The central bank in Brazil issued something called PIX, which is kind of an online transfer mechanism that everybody uses, and they have been very successful in reducing cash. And then you have Argentina, and Argentina's kind of, I told you, we like experiments, okay? So Argentina is kind of amazing. Today, people are using a third of the cash than they were using when I was governor of the central bank. When I was governor, I launched a series of initiatives. For example, I made transfers free. I wanted to make electronic payments to be as good as cash, so they were totally free. I did something which was kind of, I think, pretty cool, which we allowed people to name their bank accounts. Instead of having a bank account number, you have a bank account name, okay? So for example, I say, I'm a fan of Bayern, okay? I'm a fan of Bayern Munich. Okay, so my account is, I'm a fan of Bayern Munich. So I'm the plumber who says, oh, pay me. And what's your account? I'm a fan of Bayern Munich. Okay? So it's easy to remember. So everybody suddenly says, give me your alias. We call it an alias. Give me your alias of a bank account. And that may sound like a little bit silly, but it made really things very easy for people to transfer as opposed to give me 023389. Do you remember? Okay. And it's 23 digits, okay? So with that, then of course we started imposing QR payments. We made QR codes interoperable and everything. So this has been a tremendous success. Okay, but of course, basically it means the demand for money base has been falling quite dramatically. Okay, because some of these payment mechanisms are provided by platforms which are outside the central bank. Okay? So you have your money in your, say, Argentinian Amazon, and you have an account there, and then these guys basically you trade there. Okay? So I think this is kind of an interesting. I think this is an interesting thing. This is just a regression that I did with circulation over GDP after 2017. So you see that you have the big shock of COVID, which is on the graph, and then we have this big trend afterwards. But again, I mentioned, if you put like a quadratic to see if this is slowing down or not, actually it's accelerating. But I think it's just there's not enough data to make a statement. I have the hunch that this is a process because of technological change that is accelerating, but we still don't have sufficient evidence to prove that. Anyway, so I'm going to do one last slide on Milei, because we said, okay, we have this hyperinflation of V, okay? And I said, well, maybe V is going to be an issue for central bank. This is kind of the main take of my presentation. And you're going to have, why is it going to be an issue for central banks? Because you're going to have alternatives, private alternatives to trading, which is going to fundamentally change the demand for official currency. So central banks have to start thinking about this issue. And then you have a bunch of these private currencies or private means of payments. Some will succeed, some will fail. So we're going to be seeing a lot of hyperinflations on these alternative means of payments that fail as a business proposition, okay? Now, remember that we said the hyperinflations had two types. Now we had the ones which come from currency substitution, which is what I'm talking about, and the ones which come from fiscal dominance. And it was mentioned here that fiscal, and we were talking about this yesterday in the dinner, that you have very significant fiscal imbalances. And sometimes people say, well, fiscal imbalances at the end of the day are corrected by inflating the debt away. Okay, so there is a pressure to kind of inflation comes again with a weird way of fiscal dominance. And people were referring, I mean, why is Trump saying that he wants to intervene the Federal Reserve? He wants more inflation to bring the ratio of debt to GDP level down, okay? So I wanted to share with you this. In Argentina, we have a new government, and our inflation was not of the, right now was not of the currency substitution, it was more of the fiscal dominance. And the president decided he was going to balance the budget, okay? And then people said, well, maybe you're going to balance the budget. It's going to take you 2 years. Maybe it's going to take you 3 years. And it's going to take you 4 years. Well, he decided to do it in 1 month, okay? So in 1 month, so he came into office in December, and in January of 2024, he had reduced the fiscal deficit of 5% of GDP to basically a fiscal surplus, okay? And I'm going to show you where this comes from, but I don't want to forget that what I want to say is that this fiscal adjustment, to many people, surprisingly, has been extremely popular with the Argentine public. Because, of course, you can do a fiscal adjustment by adjusting, for example, transfers to the poor, and that may not be so popular. In the case of Milei, he increased the real value of transfers to the poor. So what has he cut? He's cut a lot of the graft, a lot of the corruption. Each corruption scandal that gets kind of undisclosed, he goes up in the polls, okay? So after 4 years of this fiscal adjustment, his popularity remains extremely high in the kind of upper 50s of support. And basically, this is in Spanish, but I'll show you. This is primary expenditure. It's if you compare the first 4 months of 2024 and the first 4 months of 2023, the real value of government expenditures has fallen by 30%, okay? So I went to the IMF database to see what experiences do we have of a year-on-year reduction of government expenditure of 30%. There are some, but they actually are mostly at the end of wars. For example, look, Canada and the US in 1946, you have a reduction in government expenditure of 30%, but or end of civil wars in Africa or things like that. But typically, out of those circumstances, it's very unusual to see such a reduction in government expenditure, okay? So basically it comes from pensions have fallen 33%, economic subsidies to energy have fallen 35%, wages have fallen, real wages of the public employees have fallen 20%, transfers to provinces have fallen 75%, and public works have fallen 85%. Public works, by the way, you may say, oh, this is kind of weird. this is not sustainable, this is not something you should do. But in the case of Argentina, we were talking about federalism earlier on. Most of the expenses of public works that the national government does is really public works at the municipal or provincial level, which are much better taken by the provinces. So the president said, you do the public work because the government has nothing to do doing the sewage in a particular town in Argentina, okay? So basically it's a way of reducing the transfers to the provinces, okay? So I just want to leave you with the idea that fiscal adjustment, we tend to think of fiscal adjustment as something bad, but the fiscal spending, someone has to pay for it, okay? So what is the adjustment? The adjustment is the spending or is the non-spending? Because if I spend a lot, that means I have to tax people a lot to pay for that spending. I spend less, I reduce the tax on these people. So if you actually find a way to reduce this fiscal expenditure and reduce concomitantly the taxes that people have to pay to finance this expenditure, this can be extremely popular. And I think we also need to add this into the debate in the face of the big fiscal unsustainability that we're facing, say, in advanced economies. So I think maybe there's something to learn from this experience at the political level. So let me stop there. Thank you.
As soon as Moritz is back on the podium, we go straight into question and answer. Who wants to break the ice this time? Microphone, do we have it? Yep.
Okay, thank you both for very interesting presentations. So the first one about this shift in the sovereign debt structure from commercial banks to bonds. Isn't it also that there is less asymmetry or bailout asymmetry if bondholders were more likely somehow to be liable than those huge banks which could be rescued, which are probably too big to fail? There is not only, like you mentioned, probably more information, but also less asymmetry and less maturity transformation, right? If also other type of investors hold those bonds. Okay, that's my question.
Does it go to Moritz or to Federico?
To Moritz, sorry, Moritz.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, I think it's partly true. What you have when you go to bond financing, typically sort of the tenor increases. So the vulnerability is being reduced. So clearly there will not be a bailout of bondholders anywhere. If you are sort of a pension fund or an asset manager and you packed your portfolio full of Brazilian bonds and Brazil defaults, don't hope for the regulator or anyone to come in. If you're a large bank, maybe you do. But the risk of an accident happening is much smaller. So the incentive structure may be different, but the American banks, when they lend excessively to Latin America, plus some other countries, Philippines, Nigeria, etc. It's not only Latin America, but mostly. It was a mistake of risk management. We have this famous saying of Walter Wriston, who was running Citigroup at the time: countries don't go bust. Well, guess what? They do. And we've seen sort of the ratings going up, and they document this. They're like historians of default, if you like. And I think if you have a large number of bondholders, different investors, which do their own analysis, the risk of this exuberance is much reduced. And of course, the American banking system couldn't have been bailed out because the exposure was just too big. And that's why in the early 1980s, the American administration was playing for time. Yeah. We had these multi-year restructuring agreements, then we had the Baker Plan. This was just muddling through, but not muddling through on behalf of the countries, but on behalf of the creditors. Because if the creditors had to take the loss immediately, as they did in 1988 with the Brady Plan, the American banking system would have gone down the tubes. And that was a risk way too high. And I think what we have now in terms of architecture of international lending two sovereigns is of a much more solid foundations than what we had in the 70s.
You allow me to make a comment? Yeah, I think to complement what has just been said, I think after the 2001 crisis, it became very common to use collective action clauses in sovereign bonds. And that somehow has made investors internalize the cost, you know, and that's why kind of the moral hazard debate kind of faded a little bit away. I mean, take the restructuring of Ecuador and Argentina in 2020, they both had 50% haircuts, you know, and they took it. They took it because the mechanism was sufficiently strong to induce them. So I think that's why we've heard less of the moral hazard debate recently, because the structure, the contractual structure, has really allowed us to internalize it.
Next question goes to Charles Goodhart.
It's to Federico. In the light of the failure of the currency board in Argentina in 1990, what are the preconditions, do you think, that a country has to have in place in order to introduce a currency board successfully?
Well, I think that the failure happened because the lack of fiscal discipline, correct? So eventually kind of you run into this dead end. And Argentina has a problem with its political structure. It cannot kind of manage its political demand in a way that you can do it through proper taxation. So I think that the only thing that if you want to go to a more, let's say, a monetary regime which imposes more constraint, you need to show credibly that you can adjust fiscal imbalances in a sustainable way, okay? And we were talking about yesterday night is that, for example, when Milei came and with the promises of fiscal adjustment, and trust me, I've seen a lot of policymakers in the world, but the obsession of Milei with fiscal adjustment, for me, he's kind of off the chart, okay? I don't find him, like, he's on another scale, okay? And, but still, with someone with that predicament, he came into government and nobody believed a thing. And the bonds which were trading 20 cents on the dollar continued to trade 20 cents in the dollar during the first 2 months of his tenure, until at the end of January, the government announced that it had achieved a fiscal surplus in January, and that's when the bonds started moving, okay? But the bonds are still 50 cents on the dollar, correct? With a government which is showing you a fiscal surplus and an extraordinary commitment to fiscal consolidation, 50 cents on the dollar. So that means there's still a long way for Argentina to prove that it can master its politics and it can master its social demands, or let's say interest group demands more than social demands, to have a sustainable fiscal policy. I think that would be my answer to what I think is the most important precondition.
I think we can summarize it with a small joke. So money and institutional investors are like elephants. So extremely long-term memory, but they run very fast. What's more it?
Yeah, maybe on the preconditions for a currency board, I think fiscal discipline is certainly an ingredient that you must not miss. But I think it's not the full story. I think for it really to work, you need sort of closer alignment with your host currency country. So there's more synchronicity. And also I think you need an exit strategy, because in the long term, that's not really a sustainable currency regime. And the successful currency boards that I remember are the likes which had an exit strategy, like Lithuania or Bulgaria, where, you know, so this is a bridge to the other side of the river. But if the river is an ocean, at some point you'll fall into the water. So I think exit strategy is important.
We have one final question somewhere here in the middle. We have two final questions, Andreas. Then it's first him and then Andreas. We still have enough time.
Thank you very much. I'm Matteo Gomellini from the Bank of Italy. For the first paper, I think there is quite an agreement that the institutional evolution of central banks from the 70s onward contributed very much to taming inflation. So acquiring independence, also the theoretical revolution of rational expectations, and so looking at expectations contributed. In the very nice slides, among the others, I mean, that you show, titled "Why We See Fewer Hyperinflation Episodes." There were listed 8 points, but central bank was not mentioned. So I was wondering if also in emerging markets, we can say something about growing or independence, institutional reforms of central banks that contributed to have less hyperinflation episode. And just a joke for Federico, you mentioned yourself buying a floppy disk, and I think it's very appropriate in this venue, because as we have learned 2 days ago in the Money Museum, the inventor of the floppy disk was Hungarian. Congratulations for this appropriate.
Yeah, independent central banks, of course, that's important. That's important in emerging markets as well. Great achievements have been made. I sort of summarized this under Washington consensus in a way, so that's my escape clause.
Maybe close the session with Andrea.
Right, yes, just a quick question as a thought on the basis of both of the speeches. So the availability of currency substitutions and substitutes is interesting, because on the one hand it means if you have a lot of substitutes, then that accelerates the collapse in velocity, so it could accelerate hyperinflation as such. And on the other hand, if you have a lot of substitutes around and people can quickly move out of your currency, that reduces the incentive to have a hyperinflation because it reduces its effectiveness in raising revenue. Would you agree with that as an assessment of this? So on the one hand, them being there can make a hyperinflation faster, but the existence of a lot of alternatives may make it less likely to start. And if that is the case, and this goes to the first speaker, wouldn't you say that the increased availability of alternatives may have been an important factor in why we see fewer hyperinflations? Because it has become less of a tool that you can effectively use in certain situations, given changes in the structure of the monetary system.
Yeah, I like very much the comment. It's a little bit like we were saying that having open capital markets generates better fiscal policy, because if not, the cost is higher. People can move the money much faster. So no, I think that's interesting. I think it's kind of thinking about how these new currencies are going to interact with monetary policy. I think it's something that should capture more of our attention. I think all these debates are most welcome.
Good. A round of applause for the two speakers. And may I now invite for our first session on hyperinflation when empires end. It will be moderated, I hope my pronunciation is right, by Balázs Vonák. And I'd like to invite also Paul Dani, Balázs Speder, Nathan Marcus, and Sasa Ilic to join us on the podium, and they will then run the panel until lunchtime.
Dear colleagues, so our next session is about hyperinflation after collapses of empires. And let me briefly introduce our speakers. First, Pál Danyi from Budapest University of Technology and Economics. The title of his talk, The Real Rate of the Dual Currency Hungarian Hyperinflation in 1946. The next speaker is Balázs Speder from the Central Bank of Hungary. Is going to talk about the answer for big inflations, micro-evidence from stabilizations in former Austria-Hungary. Then, Nathan